Every culture on Earth has a version of the same story. You die, a light appears. It is warm, it is pulling, it feels like home. Every near-death account, every ancient text, every shamanic tradition whispers the same instruction: go toward the light. But what if that instruction is the trap? What if the tunnel is not a doorway to liberation but a mechanism of return, a recycling architecture built by the same architects who built this world? The Gnostic texts buried in the Egyptian desert for nearly 2,000 years describe exactly that. They describe a post-mortem snare engineered by beings they called the archons. They describe the light not as the divine source but as its counterfeit, and they preserved a specific prayer, a set of spoken recognitions, designed to let the soul pass through without being caught. That prayer, that architecture, that entire system, that is what this is about. Stay with this. Before we talk about what happens after death, we have to talk about what is happening right now. Because the Gnostic framework does not begin at the deathbed. It begins at the moment of creation, or more precisely, at the moment of a catastrophic creative error that produced the world you are currently inhabiting. My name is Marcus, and if you have been watching this channel, if you sat with the full story of the soul recycling system, or worked through what the Gnostic texts actually say about the archons, then you already have the foundation for what comes next. What we are doing in this script is going deeper, not wider, deeper, into the specific mechanics of the post-mortem trap and the specific language that dissolves it. Let's begin with what the texts actually say about the world itself. The Gnostic cosmological tradition, and here I am drawing primarily on the Apocryphon of John, discovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a text scholars date to approximately the 2nd century CE, describes the material universe not as the creation of the highest divine principle, but as the product of a subordinate being acting in ignorance and arrogance. That being is called the demiurge. The name is borrowed from Plato, who used it to describe the craftsman god who shaped the material world from pre-existing matter. The Gnostics took the word and inverted its moral valence entirely. For Plato, the demiurge was relatively benevolent, a craftsman doing his best with imperfect materials. For the Gnostics, the demiurge is a catastrophe. He is not evil in the way a villain is evil. He is more dangerous than that. He is a being of immense power who operates under a fundamental delusion. He believes he is the only God. He believes the world he made is the only world. He declares, in the Apocryphon of John, and this is a direct quotation from the text, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me." The Gnostic reading of that line is not reverence, it is diagnosis. A truly supreme being, they argued, would have no reason for jealousy. Jealousy requires a rival. Jealousy requires insecurity. The demiurge proclaims his supremacy precisely because he does not know what lies above him. What lies above him is the pleroma. Not heaven, not paradise, not a destination. The pleroma is the condition of total divine fullness, the unbounded reality that preceded the material world and will persist after it. No scarcity, no entropy, no separation between awareness and its source. The Gnostic texts describe it as light that is not traveling toward anything because it is already everywhere it needs to be. The Apocryphon of John calls the highest principle the monad, the one that cannot be described, cannot be diminished, cannot be improved upon, because it is already the totality of what is real. The demiurge knows nothing of this. He constructs his world below the pleroma, in the darkness left by Sophia's fall. And if you watch the video on why the serpent in Eden was actually Sophia, you know the shape of that catastrophe already. Sophia, one of the divine aeons, emanating from the pleroma, attempted a creative act without the consent of her paired counterpart. Something broke. That breaking became matter. The demiurge emerged from what broke. This is not metaphor. This is the Gnostic account of physics. The material world is not a gift. It is the scar tissue of a divine wound. Now here is where it becomes personal. You are not from here. That is the central Gnostic claim, not as poetry, not as consolation, but as a precise ontological statement. Within every human body, according to these texts, there is a fragment of genuine pleromic light, a spark. The Greek term is pneuma. The texts describe it as something the demiurge and his archons did not intend to create and cannot fully understand. When they fashioned the human form, they were working from a template they had glimpsed, a reflection of the true anthropos, the divine human image that appeared briefly in the waters below the pleroma. They tried to replicate it. What they produced was a biological shell that, to their confusion and rage, contained something they could not manufacture: actual divine consciousness. You know that feeling you have had your entire life, that low-frequency sense that you do not belong here, that this world is narrower than it should be, that you are remembering something you cannot name. The Gnostic tradition does not treat that feeling as anxiety or pathology. It treats it as evidence. It is the pneuma recognizing the walls of its enclosure. The enclosure is the world, and the question the Gnostics spent centuries answering is this: how do you get out? The demiurge did not build the enclosure alone. This is critical to understand, because the Gnostic system is not a simple story of one bad creator god and one trapped humanity. It is a bureaucracy, a layered administrative structure of subordinate beings whose function is to maintain the boundaries of the prison, not out of malice exactly, but out of the same fundamental ignorance their creator operates under. They are jailers who do not know they are in the prison too. These beings are called the archons. The word in Greek means rulers or authorities. In the Gnostic cosmological texts, and here the hypostasis of the archons, a Nag Hammadi text scholars date to the 3rd century CE, is the most explicit source. The archons are described as the planetary governors of the material realm. There are 7 of them in most Gnostic systems, corresponding to the 7 visible planets of the ancient world: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. Each archon governs a sphere, what the ancient world called the heavens, and each sphere is a layer of the material enclosure through which a soul must pass, both on the way in at birth and on the way out at death. This is not astrology in the modern decorative sense. This is a cosmological map of captivity. The archons are not symbols of personality types. They are described in these texts as actual governing powers, whose interest is the retention of souls within the material system. Because here is what the Gnostics understood about the archon economy. Souls are the energy source. The pneumatic spark within each human being is, from the archon perspective, a resource. And a resource that escapes the system is a resource that is lost. The Apocryphon of John is extraordinarily specific about what the archons do when a soul attempts to depart the body at death. It describes them as stationed at each planetary sphere, waiting. Their function at that moment is not to judge. That framing belongs to the Orthodox traditions, and is itself, the Gnostics would say, a piece of archonic propaganda designed to make the soul feel it needs permission to ascend. The archons do not judge. They intercept, they redirect, they return. The mechanism of return is what most near-death accounts describe as the tunnel of light. I want to be careful here, because I am not saying that every near-death experience is identical, or that every person who reports seeing light is experiencing the same thing. What I am saying is what the Gnostic texts say, that the archons are described as capable of manufacturing a simulation of divine light, not real pleromic light, which the texts describe as completely alien to material experience, cold, dark, and silent, in the sense that it carries no emotional bait. The archon light is warm, it is familiar, it generates feelings of love, reunion, welcome. It is precisely calibrated to appeal to a being that has been starved of genuine divine contact for an entire human lifetime. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, dated by scholars to the 3rd century CE, contains a passage that is rarely discussed in mainstream treatments of that gospel. It describes how the archons can take the form of light and appear as divine emissaries. And this is a direct quotation from the text. The forces do not see those who are clothed in the perfect light, and consequently are not able to detain them. The inverse of that statement is the mechanism. Those who are not clothed in that light, those who do not know what they are, can be detained, can be seen, can be caught. This is not a small theological footnote. This is the central practical concern of the entire Gnostic project. Because if the archons can manufacture light, if the warm, welcoming tunnel is a lure rather than a threshold, then the most important thing a soul can know at the moment of death is not where to go but what not to follow. The Pistis Sophia, a complex Gnostic text that exists in a Coptic manuscript dated to the 4th century, but preserves material scholars believe is considerably older, contains the most extended treatment of the post-mortem landscape in the entire Gnostic library. It describes in meticulous detail the journey of the soul through the archon spheres after death, and it describes, with equal meticulous care, what happens to souls that are caught. They are stripped of the memories of their previous lifetime, infused with what the text calls a cup of forgetting, and reintroduced into a new body in the material world. The Greek term for this forgetting is Lethe, the river of oblivion in classical mythology. The Gnostics were not borrowing a metaphor. They were describing a mechanism. The forgetting is functional. A soul that remembered its previous imprisonment and its previous failed attempt to escape would be a soul that was harder to recapture. The forgetting is the reset. It is what makes the recycling system sustainable across lifetimes. You were born not knowing where you came from. That was not an accident. Let's sit with the mechanics of the counterfeit light, because this is where the Gnostic account becomes genuinely strange. Strange in a way that most modern presentations of Gnosticism gloss over because it is uncomfortable to confront directly. The claim is not that light is bad. The claim is that not all light is equivalent. The Gnostic texts establish a clear and precise hierarchy of light, and confusing the lower for the higher is not an innocent mistake. It is the mistake on which the entire recycling system depends. The pleroma, the divine fullness, is described in the Apocryphon of John as luminous. But the quality of that luminosity is explicitly distinguished from ordinary or manufactured light. The text uses the phrase, the light of the invisible spirit, and is careful to note that this light does not resemble anything within the material creation. It does not warm, it does not comfort in the way that emotional states comfort. It does not look like a tunnel with a welcoming figure at the end. The highest Gnostic texts describe the approach to genuine pleromic light as something closer to dissolution, not the loss of self, but the collapse of the false boundaries that defined the material self. It is not cozy. It is not a reunion with dead relatives. It is the experience of recognizing what you actually are, beneath every layer of material conditioning. Now contrast that with what the near-death literature describes. I want to be clear. I am not dismissing near-death experiences. I think they are among the most important data points we have about the structure of consciousness at the boundary of physical existence. What I am suggesting, and this is my reading of the Gnostic material, my interpretation, so take it as exactly that, is that the experiential content reported in the majority of near-death accounts maps almost perfectly onto what the Gnostic texts call archonic light rather than pleromic light. The warmth, the tunnel structure, the figures who identify themselves as deceased relatives or religious figures, the life review that functions as a kind of judgment, the sense of being sent back with a purpose. None of those elements appear in the Gnostic descriptions of genuine divine contact. They appear in the Gnostic descriptions of the archon encounter. The Pistis Sophia is explicit about this. The archons, it says, can present themselves as beings of light. They can generate emotional states of profound love and welcome. And a soul that does not know the difference, a soul that has no gnosis, no direct experiential knowledge of what pleromic light actually feels like, will interpret the archon encounter as a divine homecoming, will feel loved, will feel judged and found worthy, will feel, perhaps, that it is being given a choice: return to the world to complete your mission, or ascend. But the Gnostic texts say the choice itself is the final trap, because both options in that binary, return to the world or ascend through the archon spheres, keep the soul within the archon-administered system. True liberation does not look like ascending through layers of the material cosmos. True liberation looks like passing through the material cosmos entirely, to what the texts call the Ogdoad, the eighth sphere above the 7 archon spheres, the first region that is genuinely outside the demiurge's jurisdiction. The Ogdoad, above the 7 planetary spheres, the threshold of actual freedom. Most souls, the Gnostics believed, never reach it. Not because they are incapable of reaching it, but because they do not know it exists. They follow the light that is offered, rather than the light they cannot yet see. They are caught not by force but by familiarity, by the fact that the Archon light is calibrated to feel like exactly what a human soul, exhausted by incarnation, most desperately wants to feel. This is the sophistication of the trap. It does not compel, it seduces. It presents itself as the answer to a longing that the trap itself created. The Exegesis on the Soul, a Nag Hammadi text dated by scholars to approximately the 3rd century CE, describes the soul's condition using the image of a prostituted woman who has forgotten her royal origins and accepts whatever comfort is offered to her in her degraded state. The image is harsh. It is meant to be harsh. The point is that the soul in the material world has been so thoroughly conditioned to accept substitutes for real nourishment that it has lost the ability to recognize real nourishment when it might be available. It mistakes the Archon's imitation of love for love itself. And at the moment of death, when the soul is most disoriented, most raw, most hungry for exactly the warmth and familiarity the Archon light provides, that is when the substitution is most effective. This is why the Gnostic tradition developed what we would now call apotropaic prayers, spoken formulas designed not to petition a deity, but to demonstrate gnosis, to prove, in the encounter with the Archon gatekeepers, that the soul knows what it is and cannot be deceived. These are not prayers in the devotional sense. They are more like passwords, or more precisely, they are more like the testimony of a being that has remembered its own nature and is no longer susceptible to the forgetting that makes recapture possible. That prayer, its structure, its logic, its specific content as preserved in the ancient texts, is what we are building toward. But to understand why the prayer works, you first have to understand what the Archons are actually testing for. The Archons are not testing for virtue. They are not scanning for sin. They are not evaluating your moral record against some celestial ledger, the framework you were given by institutional religion, that the judgment after death is about whether you were good enough, obedient enough, faithful enough, has almost nothing to do with what the Gnostic texts actually describe. The test, as the Apocryphon of John describes it, and as the Pistis Sophia elaborates across dozens of chapters, is a test of identity. Specifically, do you know what you are, or have you forgotten? This is not a subtle distinction. It changes everything about how the encounter works. If the judgment were moral, you could prepare by accumulating good acts. You could confess, repent, perform the right rituals. There would be a procedure. The institutional church gave you that procedure because a procedure can be controlled, administered, gate-kept. Priests become necessary. Sacraments become necessary. Obedience to the institution becomes the mechanism of your salvation. But the Gnostic understanding is structurally incompatible with this model. If the encounter with the Archons is a test of gnosis, of self-knowledge, of recognized origin, then no priest can give you what you need. No sacrament confers it. No institution can mediate it. Either you remember what you are, or you do not. And if you do not, the Archons have precisely the leverage they require. The Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century Coptic text, discovered in the 18th century and considered one of the most detailed accounts of post-mortem Gnostic navigation, describes this process in terms that are almost forensic in their specificity. The soul ascending through the regions encounters what the text calls the receivers, entities assigned to each astrological and elemental boundary layer. These receivers interrogate the ascending soul. The interrogation is not about what the soul did during its life. It is about whether the soul can correctly identify the mystery of its own nature. The term the text uses is significant. Mystery, in the Gnostic context, does not mean something obscure or unknowable. It means something that has been deliberately concealed by the archonic system, and that, once known, confers navigational authority. The soul that knows the mystery of its own divine origin can speak it. The soul that has been successfully kept in ignorance cannot. And a soul that cannot speak the mystery, that presents itself to the receivers without the password of self-knowledge, is what the text describes as being turned back, returned, recycled into another body, another life, another round of forgetting. This is not mythology, or rather, it is mythology in the precise sense that myths encode functional models of reality in narrative form. The Gnostics were describing a mechanism. They were saying, the post-mortem encounter is structured. It has a logic. The logic is not arbitrary, and you can learn it in advance. Now understand the fuller implication of this. If the Archons are testing for self-knowledge, and if the light at the end of the near-death tunnel is the mechanism by which that self-knowledge is stripped away before the test can begin, then the light is not a gift. It is the preparatory stage of the test itself. It is the amnesia induction that ensures the soul arrives at the encounter already disarmed, already empty of the one thing it needs. The soul that walks into the light walks into the forgetting, and a soul that has forgotten what it is will answer the archonic interrogation with confusion, with appeal to earthly identity, with the name it carried in the material life, none of which are the answer the encounter requires. Think about what this means in practical terms. It means that the preparation for this encounter cannot happen after death. It cannot happen at the moment of passing. It cannot happen in the tunnel. By then, if the Gnostic model is accurate, the preparation window has already closed. The work of remembering has to happen here, in the body, in the material life, while the divine spark is still clothed in matter, but before it has been handed back to the light that erases it. This is why the prayer we are building toward exists, not as a ritual to be performed at death, as a practice of pre-remembering to be undertaken during life, so that what is known becomes deeply enough encoded in the divine essence that even the amnesia field of the tunnel cannot fully extinguish it. The Archons are testing for something specific. The prayer is the practice of becoming someone who already knows the answer. The Gnostic cosmological texts do not describe the Archons vaguely. They name them. They assign each one a domain, a function, a specific characteristic, and a position in the layered structure of the material cosmos. This level of taxonomic precision is one of the things that distinguishes Gnostic cosmology from the kind of generalized spirituality that gestures toward dark forces without ever specifying what they are or how they operate. The Gnostics were not vague about this. They were mapping a system. The Apocryphon of John gives the most detailed account. It describes the chief architect of the material world, the Demiurge, called Yaldabaoth, as having generated 7 rulers from himself, one for each of the planetary spheres recognized by ancient cosmology. These are not merely astronomical bodies. In the Gnostic framework, as in the Hermetic tradition that developed alongside it, the planets are also psychological and archontic forces. They correspond to specific qualities of consciousness that, when operating correctly within the pleroma, are expressions of divine emanation. But in the hands of the Demiurge and his offspring, they become coercive. They become the governors of fate. The 7 Archons named in various Gnostic texts include figures whose names blend Hebrew divine names with distorted qualities. Yaldabaoth himself, the lion-faced serpent, governs the outermost sphere. Within him, the others subdivide the interior regions. The Apocryphon of John identifies them with qualities like ignorance, desire for power, jealousy, envy, and arrogance. The same qualities that, in the Gnostic analysis, constitute the psychological atmosphere of the material world. This is not accidental. The Archons do not merely govern external space. They govern internal psychological territory. The qualities of consciousness that keep the divine spark imprisoned are not imposed from outside. They have been structured into the experience of embodied life itself. This is a crucial point, and it deserves to be held for a moment. When you feel trapped by circumstances, when you feel that your desires are controlling you rather than you controlling them, when you experience the specific grinding quality of material existence, the Gnostic diagnosis is not that these are moral failures. They are archonic impositions. They are the governors operating as designed, producing in the embodied soul the exact psychological states that guarantee amnesia and compliance. Desire keeps you incarnated because you believe satisfaction is available here. Fear keeps you incarnated because you believe the only alternative to this life is annihilation. Jealousy, arrogance, the appetite for power. Each of these is an archonic signature, a mechanism by which the divine spark is kept looking outward, into matter, rather than inward toward its own luminous origin. The Pistis Sophia layers additional complexity onto this. It describes a system of what it calls the fate sphere, a mechanism that binds souls to cycles of return, not through random chance, but through an administered, structured process. The archons in this account are the administrators of fate. They assign souls to bodies. They calibrate the degree of forgetting. They measure and distribute the conditions of the coming life based on the residual attachments and unresolved archonic imprints the soul carries from the previous one. This is not karma in the Eastern sense, which has a moral and developmental logic aimed at eventual liberation. This is something more coercive. The Pistis Sophia describes it as a system designed to perpetuate itself. But here is what the texts also say, and this is where the architecture of the prison reveals its structural vulnerability. The archons have power over the soul only insofar as the soul does not know what it is. The moment genuine gnosis, genuine self-recognition, arises in the embodied being, the archonic hold begins to fracture. Not because gnosis is a weapon deployed against the archons in some external confrontation, but because gnosis dissolves the one thing the entire system depends on, the soul's own complicity in its imprisonment. You cannot effectively imprison someone who knows with certainty they do not belong in the cell. Not forever. The archonic system is not designed to contain a soul that has fully remembered its pleromatic origin. It is designed to contain souls that mistake the material world for the totality of reality. Souls that believe the light at the end of the tunnel is home. The system is efficient precisely because its subjects cooperate with it, not out of wickedness, but out of genuine confusion about what they are. The prayer we are building toward works within this architecture. It is addressed, in its structural logic, to each layer of the archonic system in sequence. It is the spoken recognition of what each archon governs, combined with the declaration that the ascending soul is not subject to that governance. It is, in short, the map of the prison recited by someone who has learned, while still in the cell, that they are not what the prison was built to hold. To understand why the divine spark is inside you at all, why there is something in you that the archons cannot fully neutralize, that the tunnel's amnesia field cannot fully extinguish, that the archonic interrogation cannot fully defeat, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Genesis, to what happened before Genesis, to the event the Gnostic texts place at the root of the material cosmos, and that they describe with a specificity and emotional texture that is unlike anything in canonical scripture. In our earlier video on why the serpent in Eden was actually Sophia, we traced part of this story, but for the prayer to make complete sense, we need to return to it from a different angle, not as a story about Eden, but as a story about what you contain and why it got there. Sophia is one of the divine emanations of the pleroma. In the Valentinian framework, which is one of the most sophisticated Gnostic theological systems ever developed, the pleroma consists of a series of paired emanations, what the Valentinians called syzygies, that together constitute the fullness of divine being. Sophia is the last of these, the outermost of the pleromatic emanations, and her position at the boundary of the pleroma is both her nature and her vulnerability. She is wisdom, and wisdom by its nature reaches toward what it does not yet know. What happened next is described in various forms across multiple Gnostic texts. The Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the hypostasis of the archons, the trimorphic protonoia, they each approach it from a different angle, but the core event is consistent. Sophia moved without her consort. In the pleromatic system, emanation is a paired process. Valentinian theology is explicit about this. Every divine expression has a counterpart, a complementary pole, and movement within the pleroma occurs in balance between these paired aspects. Sophia moved alone. She willed the creation of something from within herself, without the balancing principle of her partner, without the sanction of the pleroma as a whole, and the result was not what she intended. What emerged was deficient, imperfect. The texts describe it in terms that range from a formless shadow to a monstrous figure, the proto-demiurge, the blind god who would look at himself and declare himself the only divine being in existence. This is Yaldabaoth, the product of an incomplete divine act, a being of power without understanding, capable of creating, but incapable of creating with full light, because the light from which it was drawn was already diluted by the error of its emergence. Sophia's response, when she recognized what she had produced, is one of the most remarkable moments in all of Gnostic literature. The text does not describe her as detached, it describes her as devastated. The Apocryphon of John uses language of genuine anguish, Sophia mourning what she has created, repenting of the act, seeking to correct the consequence, and her attempt at correction is what places the divine spark inside human beings. Yaldabaoth, having declared himself God and generated his 7 archonic rulers, set about creating the material world and ultimately the human body, but the human form he produced was inert. The texts describe it lying on the ground, unable to move, essentially a biological machine with no animating principle. It was Sophia who provided what was missing, or rather, it was the consequence of Sophia's act that inadvertently seeded the human form with something Yaldabaoth did not intend to include. The divine light that had passed through Sophia's incomplete emanation had left a trace, a fragment of plerimatic consciousness, diminished, embedded in matter, but genuinely there. Not a copy of divine light, not a metaphor for spiritual potential. The actual substance of plerimatic being, encrypted inside the material form the demiurge built. This is what the Gnostics meant when they said the divine spark is within you. Not that you are spiritually significant in the way a religion tells you that you matter to God, but that you literally contain, at the level of your deepest nature, a fragment of the consciousness that preceded and exceeds this entire material system. The Archons know this. Yaldabaoth knows this. The entire structure of the material prison, the amnesia, the archonic governors, the recycling tunnel, exists in response to this fact. The system is not designed to destroy the divine spark. It cannot destroy it. It is designed to keep it so thoroughly confused about its own nature that it never activates, never remembers, never finds its way back to the pleroma that is its actual origin and home. This is why the prayer is not a request. You do not ask a divine being to help you. You are a divine being remembering that you do not need permission. The distinction is everything. A request can be denied. A remembering cannot be revoked. The prayer is the act of the divine spark speaking its own name, and in doing so, recognizing that the prison was never built to contain something that knows what it actually is. Before we go deeper into the structure of the prayer itself, we need to address the most significant piece of contemporary evidence for the framework we are building, because the Gnostic model of the post-mortem tunnel is not only preserved in ancient texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it is being described right now, in clinical settings, by people who did not read the Apocryphon of John, who have never heard of Yaldabaoth, and who come back from their near-death experiences with accounts that are structurally consistent with what the Nag Hammadi texts encoded 18 centuries ago. Near-death experience research is a legitimate and extensively documented field. Raymond Moody's foundational work in the 1970s established the basic phenomenological profile, the sensation of leaving the body, the movement through a dark tunnel, the encounter with a brilliant light that is experienced as loving and welcoming, the appearance of deceased relatives or religious figures, and in many cases, the sense of a boundary or barrier beyond which the experiencer does not cross before returning. Subsequent researchers, Kenneth Ring, Pim van Lommel, Bruce Grayson, have replicated the core structure of these accounts across thousands of subjects in multiple countries and cultural contexts. The mainstream interpretation of this data is that the near-death experience is evidence of something like an afterlife, that the light is benevolent, that the deceased relatives are genuinely present, and that the experience as a whole supports a broadly comforting picture of what happens when consciousness leaves the body. This interpretation has become the dominant popular understanding. It appears in books, documentaries, and television specials. It is, by now, almost as culturally embedded as the Christian heaven it partly echoes. But there is a subset of the near-death research that receives significantly less attention, and what it describes maps onto the Gnostic framework with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. A portion of near-death experiences, the percentage varies by study but consistently appears in the literature, report not comfort but pressure, not invitation but compulsion. They describe the movement toward the light, not as a freely chosen approach, but as something closer to a current they were caught in. Some describe feeling pulled. Others describe the light not as warm and personal, but as overwhelming and undifferentiated, a totality that would absorb rather than embrace. A smaller but documented subset report that something in them resisted, that an impulse arose, not fear of death, but a specific sense that going fully into the light would mean losing something essential, something they were not prepared to surrender. These accounts are rarely the ones that get turned into best-selling memoirs. They are the accounts that appear in the appendices of academic research volumes, in the peer-reviewed papers that note, carefully, that not all near-death experiences conform to the comforting template. The ones where the experiencer comes back, not with peace, but with urgency, with the specific sense that they were almost captured by something that presented itself as salvation. The Gnostic texts anticipated this testimony, not because the Gnostics had near-death experiences in the clinical sense, though various forms of visionary practice and induced altered states were certainly part of Gnostic ritual life, but because the model they were working from predicted exactly this phenomenology. A light that is experienced as loving by souls who have already been prepared for amnesia would feel, to those souls, like coming home. A light that functions as an amnesia induction mechanism would naturally present itself in the most psychologically compelling terms available to the soul encountering it. Familiar faces, divine warmth, the end of suffering. This is not cruelty in the simple sense. It is a system optimized for capture. And a system optimized for capture does not announce itself as a trap. What the Gnostic framework adds to the near-death data is a diagnostic principle. The question is not whether the light felt good. The question is, what happens to your self-knowledge in its presence? A genuinely liberating encounter with the divine would not require you to surrender your memory of who you are. It would not dissolve your gnosis. It would not deliver you, emptied and reset, back into the cycle of material incarnation. A genuine return to the pleroma, to the fullness of divine being from which the divine spark originates, would be a remembering, not an erasing. If you find yourself in that tunnel, the Gnostic texts are saying, the fact that the light feels like love is not sufficient evidence that it is. Love that requires your amnesia as the price of admission is not pleromatic love. It is archonic management. The prayer we are building toward is the preparation for exactly that moment. Not the moment of fear, but the moment of seduction. Because the seduction is the actual danger. The fear you can resist through knowledge. The seduction requires something deeper. It requires that you have so thoroughly practiced knowing what you are, that even in the presence of overwhelming warmth and apparent welcome, the divine spark in you does not mistake the bait for the destination. So let us build that knowledge now, layer by layer. Because the prayer only works if you understand what it is addressing. And what it is addressing is a system, not a random cosmic accident, not a vague spiritual fog that gathers after death. A system, engineered, intentional, and remarkably consistent across every culture that has ever described the after-death experience in detail. The Gnostic cosmological texts are specific about this. The Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia, the hypostasis of the archons. These are not vague spiritual allegories. They are architectural blueprints of a containment structure. And what they describe, when read together, is this. The material realm is not the only prison. It is the innermost layer of a nested prison system. Think of it this way. You are familiar with the concept of the archons as administrators of this world. The texts we covered in the video on archons describe them as the forces that govern material existence, that enforce the constraints of time, decay, scarcity, suffering. But what the Pistis Sophia adds, what deepens the architecture considerably, is the description of what exists above the material layer and below the pleroma. There are intermediate zones. The texts call them the regions of the middle, and these intermediate zones are not liberation. They are holding chambers. The Pistis Sophia, which scholars date to somewhere between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE, contains a sustained account of what happens to souls after physical death. It is detailed in a way that makes most people uncomfortable because it reads less like poetry and more like a procedural manual. Souls are received in these intermediate zones by what the text calls the receivers, beings assigned specifically to the task of processing the incoming dead. These receivers evaluate the soul, they weigh it, and depending on their assessment, they return it. Return it. That word matters. Not release it. Not elevate it. Return it. To matter. To embodiment. To another cycle in the material world. This is the mechanism. This is what the Gnostic texts are describing when they speak of the soul recycling system. And if you watched the full video on that subject, you already know the outline. But what we are going into now is the specific intervention point, because the system has a vulnerability, or rather, the system has a gate, and at the gate, there is a procedure, a challenge and response. And if you know the correct response, the gate opens in a different direction. The Coptic texts preserved at Nag Hammadi are not alone in describing this. The Hermetic literature, the Orphic gold tablets discovered in graves across Greece and southern Italy, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, different traditions, different vocabularies, but the same underlying functional description. At the moment of death, the soul encounters a threshold. At that threshold, something is offered. Light, warmth, familiar faces, the voice of a loved one, the sensation of coming home. And if the soul accepts that offering without examination, it is processed. The Orphic tablets are particularly instructive here because they were literally buried with the dead as instruction manuals. Small gold leaves, inscribed with text, placed in graves across the Mediterranean world, beginning around the 5th century BCE. The texts on these tablets are directions, explicit navigational directions for the soul after death. They specify which spring not to drink from, the spring of forgetting, Lethe, and which spring to seek, the spring of memory, Mnemosyne. They include the precise words the soul must speak to the guardians of the underworld to pass through without being returned. This is not metaphor. These were physical objects placed with physical bodies by people who believed, with absolute seriousness, that the words written on those tablets would be needed, that the soul would encounter something requiring a specific verbal response, that without those words, the wrong outcome would follow. The Gnostic tradition extends this idea considerably. Where the Orphic tablets offer navigational instructions in fairly general terms, the Sethian Gnostic texts, the Apocalypse of Adam, the Three Steels of Seth, the Gospel of the Egyptians, offer something more specific, the actual names and natures of the gatekeeping forces, along with the declarations the soul must make to move past them. Not requests, not prayers in the conventional supplicant sense, declarations, assertions of identity. This distinction is everything. A supplicant asks for permission. A being that knows what it is, asserts what it is. The Gnostic after-death navigation is not about earning passage. It is about recognizing that the gatekeepers have no legitimate authority over what the soul actually is, only over what the soul believes itself to be. The moment of leverage is the soul's own self-knowledge, and that self-knowledge cannot be improvised in the moment of death. It has to have been practiced, internalized, made automatic through repetition. The hypostasis of the archons, a Nag Hammadi text whose title translates literally as "the reality of the rulers," is blunt about the nature of the archonic interest in human souls. It does not frame the archons as evil in any cartoonish sense. It frames them as hungry, and what they hunger for is light, specifically the fragment of divine light, what the texts call the pneuma, the spiritual spark, that Gnostic cosmology holds is embedded in human beings. The cosmological backstory matters here. The Gnostic origin myth, across its many variations, holds that when Sophia fell, when that eon of divine wisdom acted outside the pleroma and generated the demiurge, the resulting creation was imperfect. The demiurge and the archons built the material world, but they could not animate it with genuine life. The spark of animation, the living light, came from the pleroma, accidentally, according to some texts, or through Sophia's lingering influence according to others. The material body is the archon's construction. But the light inside the material body is not. This is why the system is designed the way it is. The Archons built a world that traps pleromatic light in matter, and when that light attempts to leave matter at death, the recycling mechanism catches it and returns it to matter. From the Archon's perspective, and the hypostasis of the Archons gives us access to exactly that perspective. This is simply maintenance. Keeping the lights on, keeping the system running. The divine sparks are the fuel. If this sounds abstract, let me make it concrete. The text describes the chief Archon, whom it names Samael, a name meaning the blind god, as ignorant of the pleroma above him. He does not know what he does not know. He believes he is the highest power. He believes the material realm is the totality of existence, and he administers his prison sincerely, with complete conviction in his own authority, having no awareness that what he is managing contains something that was never his to manage. The intermediate zones, the holding chambers, the receivers described in the Pistis Sophia, these are all extensions of the same administration. They process souls not out of malice but out of institutional inertia. The soul arrives. The receiver applies the standard procedure. The soul is assessed, found to carry material residue, desire, attachment, unprocessed karma in the broadest sense, and returned. The light is recycled into a new body. The system continues. What breaks the procedure is a soul that cannot be processed by the standard procedure. A soul that, when assessed by the receiver, responds not as a processing subject, but as something the receiver cannot categorize. A soul that names itself correctly, that declares its pleromatic origin. That demonstrates, through the quality of its self-knowledge, that it does not belong to the administrative jurisdiction of the intermediate zones. The Pistis Sophia goes into considerable detail about this. It describes specific tests, specific questions the soul will face, and it describes, and this is the part that most translations underemphasize, the specific nature of the seduction that precedes the explicit challenge. Before the soul is formally assessed, it is offered comfort, familiar warmth, the sensation of being received. This is not accidental. It is the first filter. The souls that accept the comfort without question self-select for processing. The souls that maintain their orientation through the comfort, that hold their self-knowledge steady even when being told they are home. These are the souls the standard procedure cannot close around. The first-century Valentinian tradition, which represented one of the most philosophically sophisticated developments of Gnostic thought, articulated this as the difference between hylics, psychics, and pneumatics, the material, the soul level, and the spiritual. Valentinus and his school were not describing fixed castes. They were describing states of self-knowledge. A pneumatic is not a person of a particular type. A pneumatic is a person who knows what they are. The knowing is the classification, which means the classification can change, which means the preparation, the practice, the prayer, the cultivation of self-knowledge is not decoration. It is the mechanism. This is the thing I want you to hold. The Archons do not need your fear. Fear, in fact, is relatively easy to work with. A fearful soul is still an identified soul, still presenting as a separate subject encountering a foreign power. What the recycling system is actually optimized to capture is unexamined acceptance. The soul that moves toward the light, not because it knows the light is safe, but because the light feels like coming home. That unreflective movement is all the system requires. The prayer we are building is the antidote to exactly that moment of unreflective movement. There is a word the Gnostic texts use for the kind of knowledge that matters at the threshold. Not pistis, that is faith, belief, the acceptance of a proposition you cannot verify. Not episteme, that is ordinary acquired knowledge, the kind that lives in memory and can be forgotten. The word is gnosis, and gnosis functions differently from both. Gnosis, in the Gnostic technical sense, is experiential self-knowledge, not knowledge about something external, knowledge of what you are. The Gospel of Truth, a Valentinian text discovered at Nag Hammadi and dated by scholars to around the mid-2nd century CE, describes it this way: Gnosis is the ignorance dissolving, not new information arriving from outside. something that was already present being recognized. The analogy the text uses is waking from sleep. You do not learn that you are awake, you simply stop dreaming. This matters enormously for the question of the threshold, because if gnosis were ordinary acquired knowledge, if it were information stored in the memory, then it would be subject to all the conditions that affect memory: stress, overwhelm, the disorientation of a major transition. Death is, by any measure, the most significant transition a human being undergoes. If what you need at that threshold is merely information you memorized, the information is vulnerable. The conditions of death, the dissolution of the body, the shock of sudden discontinuity, the overwhelming sensory and affective content of the intermediate state, these conditions are not hospitable to calm memory retrieval. Gnosis works differently. The Nag Hammadi texts consistently describe it as something that, once awakened, is not stored in the ordinary way. The Gospel of Philip, a Valentinian text from roughly the same period, uses the image of fire. A small fire can be extinguished by the addition of a large quantity of material. But a large fire cannot be extinguished by the same means. The material is consumed instead and becomes part of the fire. Gnosis, when it is genuinely awakened, is the large fire. The overwhelming sensory experience of the intermediate state is the added material. The question is, which one is larger when you arrive at the threshold? This is why the Gnostic teachers emphasized practice. Not ritual practice in the sense of accumulated religious merit, not devotional practice in the sense of relationship maintenance with a deity. Practice in the phenomenological sense, the repeated cultivation of a particular quality of awareness that eventually becomes the baseline from which you operate. Anamnesis, unforgetting, the slow, deliberate practice of recognizing what you are beneath the accumulated layers of conditioned identity. I have thought about this question for a long time. What does it actually feel like to practice gnosis? And the honest answer I have arrived at is that it feels, at first, like a very subtle form of grief. Because to genuinely contact the awareness that you are not the body, not the accumulated social identity, not the narrative of experiences that constitutes your ordinary sense of self, to contact that awareness clearly, is to feel the weight of everything you have invested in those layers. The identifications feel real, precisely because you have maintained them. Releasing them, even momentarily in meditation, produces something that resembles mourning, and then, after the mourning, something very still, something that cannot be named with ordinary vocabulary, because ordinary vocabulary was built to navigate the material realm, not to describe what exists prior to it. The Tripartite Tractate, a Nag Hammadi text associated with Valentinian thought, and dated to the 3rd century CE, describes the pneumatic nature as something that does not need to be created or achieved. It needs to be remembered. The Greek word it uses in context is anamnesis, unforgetting. The soul does not need to acquire its divine nature. It needs to stop performing its material identity long enough to notice what has always been underneath. The prayer we are moving toward is built on this foundation. It is not a magic formula that works independently of the practitioner's state. It is not an incantation that produces an effect through correct pronunciation, regardless of the speaker's understanding. It is a structure for awakening and stabilizing gnosis at the threshold, for ensuring that the large fire is large enough when the moment comes. The words are a framework. The practice that makes the words effective is gnosis itself. And here is the uncomfortable implication of all of this. You cannot begin preparing at the threshold. The threshold is not the preparation period. The threshold is the exam. The preparation happens here, now, in the material realm, in the body, in ordinary consciousness, which is precisely why the Gnostic teachers taught what they taught to living people, rather than leaving instructions only for the dying. The prayer is for the living, its application is at death, but its power is built in life. Now we can look directly at what the texts actually say, not as background, as content. The Nag Hammadi corpus contains several texts that include what scholars classify as after-death navigation material, specific verbal formulas, declarations of identity, and responses to anticipated challenges from archonic gatekeepers. The most structurally complete of these appear in Sethian Gnostic texts, particularly the Apocalypse of Adam and the sections of the Gospel of the Egyptians that deal with the ascent of the soul through the archonic realms. But the most functionally detailed framework, the one that comes closest to a complete procedure rather than a fragmentary instruction, appears in the Pistis Sophia, and within the Pistis Sophia, in a section that most introductory treatments skip over, because it is dense and procedural rather than philosophically elegant, there is a sequence that describes exactly what a prepared soul does differently from an unprepared one at each stage of the post-mortem passage. The unprepared soul, the Pistis Sophia tells us, is recognized by its confusion. It does not know where it is. It does not know what is addressing it. It responds to the receivers from a position of disorientation, which means it responds as what it appears to be, a fragment of material existence, confused, seeking comfort, making itself available to the standard procedure. The light in the tunnel, in this framework, is not merely an exit. It is a recognition trigger. It activates the soul's deepest conditioning. Come home. You are safe. Come toward the warmth. And the conditioned soul, having no other reference point, obeys. The prepared soul responds differently, not from courage in the ordinary sense, not from resistance or refusal, from recognition. The first move of the prepared soul at the threshold is not to resist the offered light, but to name it correctly, to say, in the functional equivalent of prayer, I know what you are, I know what I am. These are not the same thing. This is the structural core of the Gnostic after-death declaration. It has three movements. The first is identification of the self, not the material self, not the accumulated personality, but the pneumatic nature, the plerommatic spark. I am not the body I have vacated. I am not the experiences that body accumulated. I am the light that preceded the body and will outlast every archonic jurisdiction. The second movement is non-recognition of the offered alternative, not rejection in the sense of opposition. Opposition still implies relationship, still engages with the offered thing on its own terms. Non-recognition is different. The Gnostic formula does not say to the tunnel light, you are false, I reject you. It says, I do not recognize your authority. I do not recognize this place as my destination. This distinction is subtle and critically important. Rejection creates a confrontation. Non-recognition withdraws from the relational field entirely. You cannot process a soul that is not participating in your processing category. The third movement is the assertion of destination, not a request for the pleroma, not a prayer in the supplicant sense, asking a higher power to grant passage. An assertion, I am returning to the light from which I came, not the light you are showing me, the light that preceded you and your jurisdiction, and the world you administer. The texts use specific names here, plerommatic names, aeon names, the names of the divine emanations that constitute the fullness, as identification markers, as if showing a passport at a border, not asking to be allowed through, demonstrating that you were always a citizen of somewhere else. The first Apocalypse of James, a Nag Hammadi text that scholars date to the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE, contains a remarkable passage in which the risen Christ instructs James in exactly this kind of after-death navigation. It includes specific questions and answers, the questions the archonic toll collectors will ask, and the answers that dissolve their authority. The text is explicit that Jesus is providing these instructions not for the distant future, but for practical use. James will need them. He is told what to say. He is told the words matter not as magic, but as demonstration. The words are proof of self-knowledge, and the self-knowledge is what the gatekeepers cannot override. I want to sit with that word, toll collectors, because the first Apocalypse of James uses a specific Coptic term that translates into that economic metaphor, toll collectors. Not demons, not monsters, bureaucrats, officials of an administrative border system who collect what souls owe before allowing passage. And what they collect is identity. The soul that arrives not knowing what it is, pays in full. It surrenders its identity to the assessment process and receives back a new material assignment. The soul that arrives knowing what it is has nothing to surrender. The toll collector has no jurisdiction over plerommatic light. It only has jurisdiction over the material identified soul that presents itself as belonging to the material system. Know what you are, and you have already paid nothing and owe nothing. This is the mechanism, and the prayer builds on this mechanism directly. So let's look at the prayer directly. Not the idea of the prayer, not a summary of what the prayer accomplishes, the actual architecture of the thing, how it is built, what each component does, and why the sequence matters. The Gnostic texts that preserve versions of this ascent prayer, primarily the Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia, and certain sections of the Nag Hammadi codices recovered in Egypt in 1945, do not present it as a devotional poem. They present it as a functional mechanism. The distinction is critical. A devotional poem asks, this structure declares. That difference is not stylistic, it is cosmological. When you ask, you position yourself as a petitioner. You position the entity you're addressing as a superior, with the power to grant or withhold. You are already inside a hierarchical framework. You have already agreed, implicitly, that someone or something above you holds jurisdiction over your situation. The toll collector model works perfectly on petitioners because a petitioner has already conceded that a toll exists and that payment is legitimate. Declaration operates differently. Declaration does not acknowledge the jurisdiction. It asserts a prior identity that pre-exists the jurisdiction entirely. You are not requesting passage. You are stating what you are, and the statement itself dissolves the checkpoint. The prayer moves through 4 distinct phases, not 4 stanzas, not 4 emotional movements, 4 functional operations that correspond to 4 cosmological realities the Gnostic framework identifies as layers of the ascent problem. The first phase is origin declaration. You state where you come from, not where your body was born, not the city, the family, the lineage that your material identity inherits. You state pleromatic origin. You identify yourself as a fragment of the fullness that preceded the material construction, using the specific language of that origin, the light language the texts associate with pleromatic consciousness. This is not metaphor. You are not poetically describing yourself as coming from the light, the way a motivational speaker might tell an audience they are made of stars. The Gnostic texts are precise. The origin declaration activates a recognition protocol. The archonic system was designed to identify material identified souls. A soul that declares pleromatic origin does not register in the material identification system. It is, in the language of the texts, invisible to the toll collectors. The second phase is the refusal, and this is where the prayer becomes genuinely radical. The refusal is not a refusal of evil. It is not a refusal of temptation in the conventional spiritual sense. It is a refusal of the material system's claim on the soul's identity. The texts are specific about what the archons claim. They claim that the soul was formed by them, that the passions and desires and fears and the body itself were their construction, and therefore the soul belongs to them. The refusal phase of the prayer addresses this claim directly and denies it. Not denies it emotionally, denies it legally, in the framework of archonic jurisdiction, which operates like a contract law. You cannot hold what was never yours. The soul's pleromatic substance was never archonic. The body was archonic. The fear was archonic. The craving was archonic. But the light inside the body, never. And the refusal phase asserts this with precision. The third phase is the naming of the path. The Pistis Sophia, a text of extraordinary complexity, compiled somewhere in the 3rd century CE, contains detailed descriptions of the ascent corridors, the specific passages between archonic layers that the ascending soul must navigate. The prayer doesn't navigate them passively, waiting to see what happens. It names them in advance. It declares knowledge of the route. And in the archonic toll collection system, foreknowledge of the route is itself a credential. The soul that arrives at each archonic layer, already knowing what that layer is, what it demands, and what authority it has or does not have over pleromatic light. That soul cannot be detained. Detention requires ignorance. The checkpoint works on confusion. Name the path precisely, and the path opens. The fourth phase is the return assertion, not a request to be allowed to return, not a hope that the pleroma will receive the soul. an assertion that the return has already occurred, that it is a cosmological fact, rather than a future aspiration. The Valentinian tradition, whose teachers were writing extensively in Rome and Alexandria throughout the 2nd century CE, was particularly clear on this point. The return is not an event that happens after death. The return is a recognition that happens in consciousness. The prayer's 4th phase declares this recognition as already complete, already accomplished, already homelesses. 4 phases: origin declaration, refusal, path naming, return assertion. This is the structure. And now let's move through each phase with the granularity it deserves. The origin declaration is the most counterintuitive element of the prayer for a modern audience, because every instinct we carry tells us that identity is built from the bottom up. You are your childhood. You are your experiences. You are the sum of everything that happened to you in a body, in a particular place, in a particular era of history. The archonic system, as the Gnostic texts describe it, depends on exactly this assumption. It depends on the soul arriving at the transition point, already convinced that its material history is its identity. The soul that believes it is its body, its memories, its accumulated experience. That soul self-presents as a material entity, and material entities fall under archonic jurisdiction. The origin declaration disrupts this from the first word. The Apocryphon of John, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, a text scholars date to approximately the 2nd century CE, though drawing on even earlier sources, contains a passage in which the descending divine light is given specific instructions for its return journey. These instructions include precise language for how the light fragment is to identify itself at each archonic gate. The language does not begin with what the light has experienced. It begins with what the light is, prior to experience, prior to embodiment, prior to the material construction that gave it a name and a face and a story. The Sethian Gnostic tradition, one of the oldest streams of Gnostic thought, predating even the most conservative scholarly dating of the New Testament canonical texts, preserved this origin declaration in what researchers call the Great Invisible Spirit formulation. The soul declares itself a child of the Father, not the demiurge, not Yaldabaoth, not the creator god of the material system, but the true Father who exists entirely above and prior to the material construction. This declaration is specific, because specificity is the mechanism. Vague spiritual feeling does not confuse the archonic system. The archonic system can process vague spiritual feeling. What it cannot process is precise plerimatic identification, because it was not built to handle what it does not own. Think about this carefully. The entire material system, the planets, the spheres, the archonic layers described in texts, like the Pistis Sophia, was built from below. The demiurge built upward, constructing layer after layer of material and quasi-material reality. The pleroma is not above the system, in the sense that it sits at the top of the hierarchy. The pleroma is prior to the system. It is what existed before the system had any reason to exist. An archonic checkpoint can evaluate everything that came after the material construction. It has no framework for evaluating what came before. The origin declaration does not beat the system. It predates the system, and what predates the system is simply outside its jurisdiction. Now, some readers of the Gnostic texts have interpreted the origin declaration as a kind of password. You say the right words and the gate opens. This interpretation is incomplete, and getting it wrong matters enormously. The declaration is not a password in the sense that any recitation of the correct syllables produces the desired result. The Valentinian teacher Theodotus, writing in the mid-2nd century CE, is explicit on this point, in passages preserved in Clement of Alexandria's excerpts from Theodotus. The declaration works only if it is true, not true in the sense that the speaker believes it, true in the sense that the speaker has actually undergone the recognition, the anamnesis, the unforgetting, that makes the declaration a statement of lived cosmological reality rather than a memorized phrase. A soul that repeats the origin declaration without having genuinely remembered its plerimatic nature is still presenting as a material identified soul dressed in borrowed language. The archons are not fooled by recitation. They are dissolved by genuine recognition. This is the first hard requirement the prayer places on anyone who would use it. You cannot simply memorize the words. You have to have actually arrived at the recognition the words express. The prayer is the final form of a process that begins much earlier, the process of anamnesis, the progressive stripping away of material identification that the entire Gnostic path is designed to accomplish. The prayer is not the shortcut. The prayer is the graduation ceremony. The work happens before the words. But when the recognition is genuine, when the soul standing at the archonic gate has actually, through whatever path, arrived at the lived understanding that its core identity is pleromatic rather than material, the origin declaration does not just open a gate. It reveals that the gate was never real. A gate only exists for an entity the gate system can categorize. Light that predates the category cannot be gated. The declaration does not persuade the archon. It renders the archon's function irrelevant. The first phase ends in transparency. The soul becomes, in the precise language of the Coptic texts, something the material system literally cannot see. Here is something the mainstream conversation about Gnostic texts almost never addresses directly. The archons claim authorship, not authority, not power. Authorship. They claim to have made the soul, and in a system where ownership follows creation, which is the foundational logic of the material cosmos the demiurge constructed, making something means owning it. The archon's claim on the soul is not tyranny in the conventional sense. It is not arbitrary cruelty. It is, by the internal logic of the system they built, a legitimate contract. You were made here. You were assembled here. The materials of your desire, your fear, your biological drive, your emotional reactivity, these were archonic materials, shaped by archonic hands, animated by archonic energy. You belong to the system that made you. This is the claim the refusal phase of the prayer must address. And it must address it on its own terms, not by appealing to a higher authority to override the contract, but by demonstrating that the contract was fraudulent from the beginning. The hypostasis of the archons, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, is particularly illuminating here. The text describes the archonic construction of the human body and the psyche in explicit detail. The archons built a body. Then they built a soul, a psychic structure, a set of patterns and tendencies and capacities that would animate the body and give it the appearance of genuine selfhood. But then something happened that was not in their plan. The pleroma breathed into what they had made. Specifically, the text describes this as divine spirit, pneuma, entering the archonic construction. And at that moment, what had been purely archonic became something the archons had not made and could not own. The critical legal point, and the texts use something very close to contract language, is that the archons can only claim what they actually made. They made the body. They can claim the body. They made the psychic patterns, the emotional architecture. They can claim those. But they did not breathe the spirit into the construction. They did not supply the pleromatic light fragment that entered the human form. And what they did not supply, they cannot reclaim. The refusal phase of the prayer articulates this precisely. It names what the archons contributed: the passions, the body, the material desires, the fear of annihilation that drives so much of human behavior, and it releases those things, not with resentment, not with spiritual drama, but with the clean clarity of a balance sheet. These things were yours. I return them, but what you did not give, I do not return. The Pistis Sophia, which contains some of the most detailed archonic dialogue preserved in any Gnostic text, includes sections where ascending souls must answer archonic demands by demonstrating exactly this accounting. The archon says, "You carry my seal." The ascending soul responds with the equivalent of, "Here is your seal. It was always yours, and I was always only passing through the region where your seal had authority." The act of return is not a loss. It is a divestiture of what was never the soul's to keep. Now, there is something psychologically important happening in this phase that the cosmological framing can obscure if we are not careful. The archonic materials, the fear, the craving, the biological drives, the emotional reactivity, these are not abstract cosmological entities the soul carries somewhere outside its daily experience. These are the experience. This is what being human feels like from the inside. The refusal phase of the prayer is not performed after the soul has already transcended these things. It is performed from within them, in recognition that they are not what the soul fundamentally is. The soul in a body, experiencing hunger and grief and desire and fear, performs the refusal not by claiming to be free of those things, but by correctly identifying those things as archonic, rather than pleromatic. You feel the fear. The fear is real within its domain, but you are not the fear. The fear is the archon's material in the archon system, and you are the pleromatic light that has been moving through that system without ever belonging to it. This distinction between experiencing something and being it is what the Valentinian tradition called gnosis in its most practical form. Not a mystical trance state, not a visionary experience, though those were certainly part of the Valentinian practice. Gnosis, in this immediate functional sense, is the real-time recognition of the difference between what you are experiencing and what you are. The refusal phrase in the prayer therefore performs something that is simultaneously cosmological and psychologically radical. It disidentifies from the archonic materials while fully acknowledging their reality. It does not pretend the fear isn't there. It simply files the fear correctly, under archonic jurisdiction, where it belongs, and removes it from the pleromatic identity column where it was never supposed to appear. When this is done with precision, the contract the archons claim becomes unenforceable. They are holding what they made. The light is already elsewhere. The Pistis Sophia is not easy reading. It is a long, repetitive, and in places almost impenetrable text, a dialogue between a risen Christ figure and his disciples, primarily Mary Magdalene, that runs across multiple books and covers the ascent of Pistis Sophia, wisdom herself, through the archonic layers back toward the pleroma. It is also one of the most detailed maps of the post-mortem terrain that any ancient text has left us, and buried inside its apparent redundancy is a structure that, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. The archonic layers are not arbitrary. They are not simply obstacles placed in the path of ascending souls, the way a game designer places enemies between a player and the final level. Each archonic layer corresponds to a specific type of consciousness, a specific mode of identification, a specific form of attachment to the material world, and the soul that arrives at that layer, still carrying that form of attachment, is detained by it. Not because a demon reaches out and grabs it, because the layer and the soul resonate at the same frequency, and resonant things do not pass through each other. They stay together. The classical Gnostic cosmology, represented in the Apocryphon of John, the Ophite diagrams described by Origen and Irenaeus in the 2nd century CE, the Valentinian schema, outlined by Irenaeus in Against Heresies around 180 CE, identifies 7 primary archonic layers corresponding to 7 planetary spheres. Each sphere is governed by an archon whose name and character the texts preserve. Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, rules the outermost functional layer, though his full domain is the entire material construction. Below him, in ascending order of what the soul encounters on its return journey, sit 6 additional archons whose names vary slightly across traditions, but whose functions are consistent. Sabaoth, in some traditions, governs one of the lower spheres. Astaphios, Hermes, Galila, Yobel. The names appear in variant forms across the Nag Hammadi corpus. What matters is not memorizing the names, but understanding what each archon represents as a functional gate. Because this is where the third phase of the prayer becomes specific in a way that has real operational content. The Ophite tradition, documented in detail by the early Christian heresiologist Origen in Contra Celsum, written around 248 CE, preserved specific spoken formulas for each archonic gate. These were not secret passwords in the mystery religion sense, phrases whispered by initiates to guardian spirits at the border of each underworld tier. They were, in Origen's description, declarations of self-knowledge directed at each specific archon that both acknowledged what that archon governed and asserted the soul's non-subjection to it. The soul approaching the sphere of the archon, associated with material desire, for instance, declared knowledge of desire's nature and origin, its archonic construction, while simultaneously asserting that the pleromatic essence of the soul had never been formed from that archon's materials. Each declaration was specific to each gate. This is what path naming means in practice. Not a general statement of spiritual superiority. A precise, gate-by-gate demonstration of actual knowledge. Knowledge of what each layer is, what it claims, and why those claims do not apply to pleratic consciousness. The implication for the prayer's third phase is clear. Generalized spiritual feeling does not suffice. Knowing in a vague sense that you are more than your body does not constitute path naming in the Gnostic technical sense. The path naming phase requires that the soul actually know what each layer represents, what form of material identification each archon exploits, and be able to address each one with specificity. The Valentinian tradition's elaborate cosmological education, the mapping of the pleroma, the canoma, the demiurgic construction, the archonic spheres, was not theological speculation for its own sake. It was cartography. You were being given the map because you were going to need to navigate the terrain. There is a phrase in the Valentinian catechetical material preserved in Irenaeus, recorded against his will, as it were, by someone who despised what he was documenting, that captures this exactly. The ascending soul, when challenged by an archon who demands to know who has authorized this passage, responds not with a name of authority, but with a demonstration of knowledge. I know where you come from, and it is the knowledge itself that constitutes the credential. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In the archonic system, authority recognizes credentials issued by other parts of the same system, but knowledge of the system's own origin, knowledge that places the archon within a larger cosmological story the archon itself may not fully understand, is a credential the system cannot issue, and therefore cannot evaluate by its own protocols. It is outside the system's assessment framework, the soul that knows where the archon came from, why the archon exists, what the archon is made of, and what the archon cannot touch. That soul has not obtained a pass from the system. That soul has demonstrated that it understands the system from a vantage point the system cannot reach. The path opens not because the soul was granted permission. The path opens because the soul demonstrated that permission was never the relevant category. So let's talk about the tunnel, not as metaphor, not as a poetic description of a psychological state, as a structure, a mechanism, something the Gnostic texts describe with a specificity that becomes uncomfortable once you start paying attention to it. The near-death experience literature has given us a culturally dominant image. The white light at the end of the tunnel, the warmth, the welcome, the figures of deceased relatives, the sense of unconditional love radiating from something vast and benevolent at the center of that light. Millions of people have reported variations of this. The accounts are strikingly consistent across cultures, across time, across religious backgrounds. And the consensus interpretation, the one that gets published in best-selling books and featured in documentary films, is that this experience is a preview of divine reunion, proof of the afterlife, evidence that something good waits on the other side. The Gnostic reading is different. Not just different as an alternative opinion, different in a way that reframes every element of that familiar description and asks you to look at what the structure is actually doing, functionally, mechanically, rather than how it feels to move through it. Here is what the Gnostic cosmological framework actually says about what meets the soul after death. The material body dies. The pneuma, the divine spark, begins its movement away from the body, and immediately the archons move, not because they are malicious in the way a predator is malicious, because this is their function. This is what they were built to do. The archonic system is a processing system. It processes souls, and the light, the warm, inviting, radiant light at the center of that tunnel, is, in the Gnostic reading, the system's primary intake mechanism. Think about what a trap needs to do to work. It needs to attract. It needs to feel safe. It needs to produce in the thing it is designed to capture a voluntary movement toward it. A trap that feels like a trap fails before the mechanism can engage. The most sophisticated traps are the ones that feel, to the thing being trapped, like exactly what it most deeply desires. And what does the pneuma most deeply desire after a lifetime inside a material body? Return, warmth, recognition, the end of the forgetting, the sensation of being welcomed home. The tunnel of light offers all of this. The warmth is real. the love radiating from it is real, in the sense that the experience of it is genuinely produced. The feeling of recognition is real, but real experience is not the same as accurate information about what is producing that experience. A lure on a fishing hook is a real piece of food. The fish's hunger is real. The satisfaction of moving toward the lure is real, right up until the mechanism engages. The Apocryphon of John, the same text discovered in the Nag Hammadi library in 1945, describes the archonic system as one that has authority specifically over the soul's movement between states, between incarnations, between the material realm and what lies beyond it. The archons in this text are gatekeepers, and the function of a gatekeeper is not to let you through. The function of a gatekeeper is to manage the threshold, to assess, to determine what passes and what is returned. The tunnel, in this reading, is not the entrance to liberation. The tunnel is the assessment corridor. What the soul encounters in that space, the warmth, the beckoning light, the familiar faces of those who came before. These are what the Gnostic tradition calls the archonic presentation, the form the management system takes when it needs the soul to move cooperatively toward reprocessing. This is not the only Gnostic text that describes this mechanism. The Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century Coptic text that the mainstream of Christian tradition did not preserve, and the institutional church actively worked to suppress, describes in considerable detail the fate of souls after death. It describes specifically what happens to souls that do not possess the recognitions, the gnosis, the specific knowledge, required to pass through the archonic checkpoints without being redirected. Those souls, according to the Pistis Sophia, are not condemned. They are returned. They are sent back into the material system, not as punishment, as continuation of the only process the archonic system knows how to run. The tunnel, then, is not the enemy. The tunnel is a function. The question is whether you understand what function it serves before you find yourself inside it. Because once you are inside it, once the warmth has closed around you and the light is pulling you forward, the window for a different kind of navigation becomes very narrow. This is what the Gnostic tradition was trying to prepare people for. Not comfort, preparation. The question that every serious student of this tradition eventually arrives at is the one the Gnostic texts themselves force you to ask. If the light is not what it presents itself as, then what is it actually made of? This is not a metaphysical evasion. The Gnostic cosmology gives a direct answer. And the answer begins with understanding what the demiurge, the false creator, the architect of the material prison, has access to, and what it does not. The demiurge, in the Valentinian school's systematic theology, worked out in the 2nd century CE, is not nothing. It is not a simple fraud, with no real substance behind it. It possesses something. It possesses a copy, a degraded but functional replica of the light of the pleroma, the fullness, the divine completeness, above and beyond the material system, which it obtained not by right but by proximity. Sophia's fall, in the Valentinian reading, produced a light emission that became the demiurge's raw material. The demiurge is, in a real sense, built out of stolen luminosity. This matters for understanding the tunnel. If the demiurge is built from a degraded copy of pleromic light, then the systems the demiurge constructs and operates are also built from that same degraded copy. They carry a genuine luminosity. They can genuinely radiate warmth. They can genuinely produce in the pneuma a sensation of recognition, because the pneuma itself is made of pleromic light, and the archonic system's imitation of it is close enough, degraded, filtered, but close enough, to produce something that feels like homecoming. This is the crux of why the tunnel is dangerous to the unprepared soul. It is not pure deception in the sense of total fabrication. Pure fabrication would be easier to recognize. The tunnel is genuine imitation. It is real enough light, producing real enough warmth, generating real enough desire to move toward it. The only thing it cannot produce is the one thing that distinguishes it from actual pleromic return, genuine dissolution of the archonic framework. The warmth closes around you, and the framework remains intact underneath it. You are held, not released, welcomed, not freed. The Pistis Sophia describes the light of the archons explicitly. It calls it A counterfeit light. The Greek word the underlying tradition uses is antimaimon, a mimicry, an imitation, something that functions like the original while being structurally different from it in the one way that matters. The pleromic light dissolves the boundary between the spark and its source. The archonic light maintains that boundary while producing the sensation of its dissolution. You feel like you have arrived home, and the mechanism has continued operating around you without interruption. Now think about what this means for the near-death experience accounts in the contemporary literature. The accounts describe warmth and love and recognition, and an overwhelming desire to move forward into the light. Many accounts also describe, and this is the detail that rarely receives the attention it deserves, a point at which the person is told they must go back, or a point at which they sense, from within the experience, that they have not yet completed something, or a point at which a figure in the light communicates to them that their time has not yet come. In the Gnostic reading, these are not random features of the experience. These are the checkpoint function making itself visible. The soul is being assessed. The soul is being evaluated against whatever archonic criteria determine whether reprocessing is immediate or whether the soul is returned to the same material body for further cycling. The sensation of being told to go back is the sensation of a system determining that the current cycle is incomplete. This is not a comfortable framing. It takes something that millions of people have found profoundly reassuring, proof that love waits beyond death, that nothing is truly lost, and asks them to consider whether the warmth they encountered was real in the way they believe it was real, or real in the sense that a sophisticated containment system producing exactly the experience most likely to generate cooperative reprocessing is also, in a technical sense, real. The Gnostic tradition does not say the experience was imaginary. It says the experience was true and its source was misidentified. That is a harder thing to sit with than simple debunking. What makes the Gnostic analysis of the light unusual, even among alternative frameworks for understanding death and what follows it, is that it does not simply say the light is evil and should be avoided. It says the light is doing precisely what it was designed to do. It is the soul's relationship to the light, specifically whether the soul possesses the gnosis to recognize the light's true nature and origin, that determines whether the encounter is a trap or a passable threshold. Knowledge does not make the light disappear. Knowledge changes the soul's position relative to it. That distinction is everything. In the video on this channel titled The Full Story of the Soul Recycling System, the archonic processing loop was traced from the moment of death through the structure of the between lives state and back into material incarnation. That video covered the broad architecture. What I want to do here is go deeper into a specific dimension of that architecture that the Gnostic texts address with a precision. Most treatments of this subject skip over the mechanics of why the soul agrees to return, because the soul does agree. That is the detail that changes everything. The archonic system is not described in the Gnostic texts as a system that operates through brute force. It is not a press gang. It does not seize the soul physically and hurl it back into a body against its will. What it does is considerably more sophisticated than that, and considerably more disturbing once you understand the mechanism. The Pistis Sophia describes the process in a way that is worth sitting with. The soul, after death, encounters the archonic realm. The archons do not immediately redirect it. They present it with what amounts to an accounting, a representation of what was incomplete, a showing of what remains unresolved, relationships that were not reconciled, purposes that were not fulfilled, debts, the text uses this kind of language, that were not discharged. And here is the mechanism. The soul, encountering this accounting, consents, not under duress in any obvious sense. It consents because the framing has been successful, because the soul's own desires, the genuine desires, the real attachments, the authentic longings that the soul carried through the life it just completed, have been activated by the archonic presentation and used as the lever that produces voluntary return. This is not manipulation in the crude sense. It is management. The system uses what is real in the soul, its genuine loves, its genuine unfinished business, its genuine commitments, to produce a decision that serves the system's continuity. The soul does not return because it was forced. The soul returns because it was shown everything it still cares about, and it reached the only conclusion a soul with those attachments could reach. Of course I have to go back. Of course there is more to do. Of course those people need me. Of course that purpose was not complete. Every single one of those conclusions is, from the soul's perspective, authentic. And that authenticity is precisely what makes the mechanism so effective. The Nag Hammadi texts, the Gospel of Philip in particular, a text from the Valentinian tradition that scholars date to somewhere in the 3rd century CE, describe the power the archons have over the soul in terms of binding. The archons cannot bind a soul that knows them. They can only bind a soul through the soul's own desires and attachments. The soul's genuine loves become, in the archonic processing framework, the chains that the soul places on itself. This is one of the most psychologically acute observations in the entire Gnostic corpus. It describes something that is recognizable without any cosmological framing at all. That the things we most love are the things that most effectively limit our freedom, when that love is expressed as clinging rather than as completion. The distinction the Gnostic tradition draws is between love that flows from fullness, pneumatic love, if you want to use the technical term, the love of a soul that knows itself and therefore loves freely, and love that flows from incompletion, from lack, from the sensation that without this relationship, or this outcome, or this unfinished purpose, something essential is missing. The first kind of love does not bind. The second kind is precisely what the archonic accounting activates. The soul that enters the between lives assessment, carrying a weight of genuine unresolved attachment, is not arriving as a prisoner. It is arriving as someone whose own heart will produce the decision the system needs. No chains are required when the mechanism is that precise. Now, the Gnostic tradition also describes what breaks this cycle. And it is not the absence of love. It is not detachment in the Buddhist sense of renunciation, though there are structural similarities that scholars of comparative religion have noted. It is something more specific. It is knowledge of the mechanism itself, the soul that arrives at the archonic checkpoint and recognizes what is happening, that recognizes the warmth, that recognizes the accounting, that recognizes its own genuine loves being activated by a system designed to use those loves as an intake protocol. That soul is not released from love. It is released from the version of love that the system can harvest. It still loves, but it loves from a place the archonic accounting cannot reach, because what it loves is no longer dependent on the material cycling for its expression or fulfillment. This is gnosis as liberation technology, not the suppression of desire, the relocation of desire to a position the archonic system cannot access. The soul recycling system is not a punishment mechanism, it is an efficiency mechanism. It keeps running as long as it has souls that carry the kind of incompletion it can use. Knowledge interrupts the fuel supply. The Gnostic tradition does not leave the soul without resources. This is the part that most popular treatments of this material miss entirely, or treat as peripheral, when in fact it is the operational center of what the tradition was actually transmitting. The cosmology was not the point. The cosmology was the map. And maps exist so that you can navigate. The Pistis Sophia, the Apocryphon of John, the first and second books of Jeu, a set of ritual and liturgical texts that are among the least read documents in the entire Nag Hammadi and related corpus, and arguably among the most important. All describe, in varying levels of specificity, what the soul needs to successfully navigate the archonic checkpoints after death. They describe in plain terms a set of recognitions, declarations, and responses that the soul must be able to produce when confronted by each level of archonic gatekeeper. Scholars have called these the passwords, the sealings, the defenses. The technical vocabulary varies across texts and traditions, but the functional description is consistent. There is a specific body of knowledge that, when held by the soul, transforms the archonic checkpoint from a recycling gate into a passable threshold. Let's be precise about what these texts actually describe, because the precision matters. The first and second books of Jeu, texts that the early church worked actively to exclude from every canonical collection, texts that survived only because they were buried in the desert where institutional suppression could not reach them. describe a ritual process in which the soul is taught, while still in the body, the responses required at each archonic boundary. Each archon, in this cosmological architecture, governs a sphere, a level of the material and psychic cosmos. The soul, ascending after death, must pass through each of these spheres. And at each sphere, the archon governing that level performs an assessment. The assessment is not arbitrary. It has a specific structure. The archon challenges the soul. And the soul must respond not by pleading or praying or asserting goodness, but by demonstrating knowledge. Specific, technical, cosmological knowledge about the nature of the archon itself, the origin of that archon, the relationship of that archon to the larger system, and, critically, the soul's own origin in a realm that precedes and supersedes the archonic structure entirely. This is what the Gnostic tradition called the gnosis of the ascent, not mystical feeling, not moral worthiness, not accumulated good deeds, specific knowledge that functions as a technical credential at a specific checkpoint. The Apocryphon of John, in passages that most commentary focuses on much less than the cosmological sections, describes the soul's ascent in terms of what it knows and can demonstrate, rather than what it has done or how devotedly it has believed. The soul that knows the pleroma, that has real, deep, functional knowledge of the divine fullness from which it came, carries that knowledge through death. And that knowledge is what the archonic system cannot counterfeit, cannot replicate, cannot produce from its own resources. This is why gnosis was terrifying to the institutional church in a way that mere heresy was not. Heresy is a wrong belief. You can correct wrong belief by substituting right belief. But gnosis, as the Gnostic tradition defined it, was not a belief at all. It was a form of direct knowing, anamnesis, unforgetting, that did not depend on institutional transmission, and therefore could not be controlled by institutions. The church could not grant it. Therefore, the church could not withhold it as leverage. Therefore, the church's entire power structure, built on the premise that it was the authorized intermediary between the human soul and divine mercy, became structurally irrelevant the moment genuine gnosis was present. This is why possession of these texts was, at certain points in late antiquity, a capital offense. Not because the church found the ideas offensive, because the ideas made the church unnecessary. Now, the 5 passwords. I want to be careful here about the language, because what the texts describe is not a literal set of 5 words to be recited. What they describe is a set of 5 categories of knowledge, 5 domains of recognition, that together constitute the full credential the ascending soul needs to navigate the archonic structure, without being redirected back into the material cycle. The first is knowledge of origin. The soul must know, not merely believe, that it comes from the pleroma, from the fullness, and not from the material system, or any of its architects. This is not a statement of faith. It is a recognition that the soul has worked into its actual structure through the practice the tradition describes as gnosis. The second is knowledge of the demiurge's nature. The soul must understand what the demiurge actually is, a degraded emanation, a product of Sophia's error, not the true God, and what therefore the demiurge's authority actually extends to, and where it stops. A soul that believes the demiurge is the highest divinity will, at the archonic checkpoint, experience the demiurge's representative as ultimate authority. A soul that knows the demiurge's origin knows that the authority being presented is local and derived, not absolute. The third, fourth, and fifth are the recognitions that the prayer tradition encodes, and those are precisely what the next section of this examination is going to open. The prayer tradition that survived the systematic destruction of Gnostic literature is not a petition. It is not a request directed at a being who might or might not comply. It is a declaration of recognition, a structured sequence of 5 specific cognitive events that, when activated in the dying or recently deceased soul, reconfigure the soul's response to the tunnel environment entirely. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire examination. If you approach the prayer as a petition, as something you offer to a higher power in the hope of favorable response, you have already misunderstood its mechanism. The prayer does not work by asking. it works by recognizing. And that difference is the difference between a soul that passes through the checkpoint unimpeded and a soul that is processed. The first recognition is the recognition of light quality. The Gnostic tradition, particularly as preserved in the Pistis Sophia, a text dating to approximately the 3rd century CE, and representing one of the most complex cosmological frameworks in all of Gnostic literature, makes a distinction that the tunnel of light near-death accounts consistently fail to notice. There are two lights. There is the light that belongs to the pleroma, what the texts call the light of the Father, the light of genuine divine origin, and there is the constructed light, the light that belongs to the material system, the light that was built by the demiurge and is maintained by the archons as part of the processing architecture. These two lights feel different. This is not metaphor. This is not spiritual poetry about how inner peace feels warm and comforting. The tradition is making a phenomenological claim. When a soul encounters the constructed light of the tunnel system, there is a quality to it that is distinct from the quality of genuine pleroma light. The constructed light compels. It attracts with a force that bypasses the soul's own will. It creates urgency, the sensation that you must move toward it, that to hesitate is to fail, that the light is where you need to be. Pleroma light does not compel. This is what the texts say, and this is the first recognition the prayer encodes. Genuine divine light does not pull. It does not create urgency. It does not produce the sensation that you must approach or be left behind. It is simply present, and the soul moves toward it or remains still, according to its own nature, without any pressure being applied. If the light you encounter after death is pulling you, if there is a quality of urgency, of magnetism, of something that bypasses your own decision-making, you are looking at the constructed light. This is the first recognition. The second recognition is the recognition of the archonic claim. The archons at the checkpoint do not present themselves as prison guards. They present themselves as authorities, as figures of divine order, as representatives of the God you were told about, as beings whose approval you need in order to proceed. The Apocryphon of John, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, and dated by scholars to approximately the late 2nd century CE, describes these checkpoint encounters in detail. The archons ask questions, they make demands, they present credentials, and the soul that was never taught what to expect responds to them as if their authority were legitimate. The second recognition is the recognition that the authority being presented is derived and local, not absolute. The archons are real, they are not invented. The tradition does not claim they do not exist, or that their power is imaginary. Their power is real within the material system. What their power is not, is ultimate. They are products of a process that had its origin in error, in Sophia's fall, in the demiurge's mistaken self-declaration, and their jurisdiction ends at the boundary of the material system. A soul that knows this can look at an archonic authority figure and recognize it for what it is: genuine power, local jurisdiction, no claim on a pneumatic soul. The third recognition is the recognition of the soul's own origin. This is the recognition the prayer makes most explicitly. It is the soul's declaration, not of hope, but of knowledge. Not, I believe I came from a place beyond this system, but I know what I am, and I know where I came from. The Valentinian tradition, preserved in the Gospel of Truth and the Tripartite Tractate, among other texts, frames this as the central gnosis, the knowledge that a spark of authentic pleroma light is resident in the pneumatic soul, that this spark was never created by the demiurge, and that the demiurge, therefore, has no ownership claim on it. You cannot be held by a system that did not make you. This is not a comforting belief. This is a jurisdictional fact. The fourth and fifth recognitions follow from this, and they are where the prayer's specific language becomes the vehicle for the transmission. The fourth recognition is the one that Gnostic scholars consistently identify as the most operationally significant component of the prayer tradition, and it is also the one that the institutional Christianity that absorbed and suppressed Gnosticism found most theologically intolerable. It is the recognition of the demiurge by name, not by title, not by the title God or Lord or Creator, by name, by its actual identity in the cosmological structure, as Yaldabaoth, as Saklas, as Samael, the three names the Gnostic texts use for the demiurge, each encoding a specific aspect of its nature. Yaldabaoth, which the Apocryphon of John translates roughly as child of chaos or child of the void. Saklas, meaning the fool. Samael, meaning the blind god. These are not insults layered on top of a theological claim. They are the theological claim. Each name encodes the tradition's understanding of what the demiurge is, a being that came from error rather than from the pleroma, that mistakes itself for the highest divinity, and that cannot perceive the true divine structure because it lacks the pneumatic spark. It is not evil in the way a moral agent is evil. It is incomplete. It is operating from a position of radical misunderstanding about its own nature, and a soul that knows this can speak the demiurge's name not with contempt, but with accuracy, naming the thing correctly, refusing the title it has appropriated, declining to treat God as its name when that name belongs to the monad that the demiurge itself has never seen. The hypostasis of the archons, another Nag Hammadi text, contains what may be the most direct formulation of this recognition anywhere in the surviving literature. When Sophia's voice comes to the demiurge and tells it what it is, tells it that it is not the highest God, that there is a Father above it, an immortal light beyond it, the demiurge's response is to build the material prison more deliberately, to bind the human form more tightly, because a God that is recognized as a lesser God is a God that loses its authority, and the soul that arrives at the checkpoint and speaks the demiurge's actual name, not as accusation, but as identification, has already dissolved the checkpoint's primary mechanism, which is the soul's misidentification of the demiurge as the ultimate authority. This is why the institutionalization of Christianity required, above all else, that the names be suppressed. Not the concept of God, that could remain, but the specific names that encoded the distinction between the demiurge and the monad had to disappear, because those names were the vehicle for the recognition. You cannot transmit the fourth recognition without transmitting the names, and the Church knew it. The Pistis Sophia preserves an account of Jesus specifically instructing his disciples in the names of the archons and their specific locations within the cosmic structure, which sphere they govern, what demands they make, what password or recognition phrase allows passage. This is not the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the Jesus of the Gnostic tradition, a revealer figure whose primary function is not moral instruction, but navigational instruction. The map he provides is a map of the post-mortem checkpoint system, and the prayer tradition is the encoded form of that map. The fifth recognition is the claiming of passage. Having recognized the light's quality, having recognized the archonic authority as local and derived, having declared the soul's origin in the pleroma, having named the demiurge correctly, the fifth recognition is the act of claiming the right of return, not asking for it, not petitioning for it, claiming it. The language of the prayer tradition, as preserved in fragments across the Nag Hammadi library and the Pistis Sophia, is consistently declarative at its climax. I am from the Father. I am of the light that was before the demiurge. I carry the seal. These are not requests. They are assertions of identity and jurisdiction. The seal, the sphragus in Greek, is a specific concept in the Valentinian tradition and in several other Gnostic schools. It is the mark of pneumatic identity, the internal recognition of divine origin that functions as the soul's credential at the checkpoint. It is not something granted from outside. It is not something earned. It is recognized. The soul that knows what it is carries the seal by virtue of knowing what it is. The prayer tradition's function is to activate that recognition under the specific conditions of the post-mortem state. Conditions that include, as the tradition describes at length, a radical confusion about one's own identity, that the constructed light and the checkpoint system are specifically designed to deepen. 5 recognitions. 1 prayer structure, a system designed not for the living alone, but for the transition that the living are always approaching. This is what was buried in the jar at Nag Hammadi. This is what was declared heretical and burned. Not because it was morally dangerous, but because it was operationally effective. Before examining what the prayer tradition prescribes for the moment of transition, It is necessary to understand the mechanism it is working against, because the tunnel, the light, and the checkpoint are only the visible components of a much larger system. The foundational component, the one without which the entire recycling architecture collapses, is not the tunnel. It is the forgetting. The Greeks had a name for it, lethe. The river of forgetting in the Orphic tradition, one of 5 rivers in the underworld, the one whose water erases memory of previous existence before a soul re-enters incarnation. The Orphic texts, which predate the Gnostic literature and which Gnostic thinkers clearly engaged with, explicitly warn initiates against drinking from lethe. Do not drink from the spring on the left, the Orphic gold tablets instruct, tablets placed in graves to give the dead navigational instruction. Go to the cold water on the right, which flows from the lake of memory. The initiate is to declare, I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my origin is heaven. This you know yourselves. This is the same structure as the Gnostic prayer tradition, encoded in an earlier idiom. Know your origin. Declare it. Refuse the amnesia. The Gnostic elaboration of this tradition is more technically specific about what the forgetting mechanism is and how it operates. The Pistis Sophia describes in considerable detail what the texts call the cup of forgetfulness, a cup administered by the Archon Sabaoth or by representatives of the demiurgic order at or near the moment of re-entry into incarnation. The soul, having navigated some portion of the post-mortem region, arrives at the point of re-entry and is offered this cup. The text is explicit. The cup contains a mixture, not simply water, a prepared compound designed specifically to induce what the text calls a seal of forgetfulness. Not natural forgetting, engineered forgetting. This is a strong claim, and the tradition makes it without apology. The amnesia that characterizes human incarnation, the fact that every human being arrives in a body with no memory of prior existence, no memory of the pre-incarnate state, no memory of whatever occurred between death and birth, is not an accident of embodiment. It is a design feature of the recycling system. Think about what this means. Every conversation you have ever had about the meaning of life, every religious framework you have ever encountered, every cultural story about what happens when you die, all of them have been conducted under conditions of total informational blackout about the most relevant prior experience you possess. You have died before, possibly many times, and you remember none of it. Not because the information is inaccessible, because the access was deliberately removed. The Valentinian tradition adds a layer to this that the other schools do not fully develop. The forgetting is not only administered at re-entry, the material world itself is a forgetting machine. The Valentinian teacher Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, describes material existence as a state of intoxication. The soul, embedded in matter, in a body with its hormonal pressures and survival imperatives and sensory flooding, is in a state of continuous distraction from its own nature. Every moment of ordinary human experience is a moment in which the pneumatic spark is present, but unrecognized, submerged in a noise level that is specifically calibrated to prevent recognition. This is what Gnostic practice is for, in the Valentinian, Sethian, and Thomasine traditions alike. Not moral purification, not preparation for divine judgment, the reactivation of recognition under conditions designed to prevent recognition. The practices differ across schools. The goal is constant. Remember what you are before you arrive at the checkpoint, so that the checkpoint does not catch you in a state of amnesia. Now connect this to the tunnel. The tunnel of light experience, as documented across thousands of near-death accounts, has one feature above all others that the Gnostic framework identifies as the system's signature: the sensation of peace. Overwhelming, total, undifferentiated peace. The soul that arrives at the tunnel entrance after the disorientation of death is in a state of maximum vulnerability. It has just lost everything familiar, every sensory anchor, every identity structure that bodily life provided. And into that maximum vulnerability, the constructed light arrives, offering peace. The tradition does not say the peace is fake. It says the peace is a function of the forgetting beginning, the relief that near-death experiences describe, the release from pain, from fear, from the weight of personal history, is the first stage of the amnesia. The soul is being relieved of the very information it needs in order to navigate the checkpoint correctly. By the time it reaches the beings of light, the life review, the choice of return, the amnesia is already well advanced. This is the genius of the system, if you want to call it that. The tunnel does not need to use force. It does not need to deceive the soul with lies. It only needs to arrive at the right moment, offering exactly what a terrified and disoriented consciousness most desperately wants: peace, light, the end of confusion, and the soul walks in willingly, every time, unless it has been taught not to. The question that follows from everything established so far is not abstract. It is the most practical question this entire subject generates. What do you actually do with this information? The Gnostic tradition has a specific answer, multiple specific answers in fact, across multiple schools and multiple centuries. And they converge on a single structural principle. The work is done before death, not at death. You do not wait for the tunnel and then try to remember the prayer. You practice the prayer. More accurately, you practice the recognitions until they are not information you hold, but dispositions you embody. Until the recognitions are so deeply integrated into the structure of your awareness that the constructed light and the archonic checkpoint cannot disrupt them, because they are not stored as memories that can be suppressed, but as orientations that are prior to memory. This is the technical content of Gnostic practice that the institutional church found not just theologically incorrect, but operationally threatening. Theological incorrectness could be argued against. Operational effectiveness had to be eliminated. The first prescribed practice in the tradition is what the Valentinian school calls gnosis of origin, and this is not the shallow motivational poster version of knowing yourself that contemporary spirituality has made of the concept. It is specific. It is a sustained, daily, deliberate practice of recognizing the pneumatic spark, not believing in it, not hoping for it, recognizing it. The distinction the Valentinian teachers drew was absolute. Faith, pistis, is what the hylic and psychic souls rely on, because they do not have direct access to the pneumatic reality. Gnosis, direct knowing, is what the pneumatic soul is capable of and what it must develop. The practice is not prayer in the conventional sense. It is not meditation as contemporary culture uses the word. It is closer to what the Zen tradition would later call kensho, a direct recognition of one's own nature that, once achieved, cannot be entirely lost. The soul that has recognized the pneumatic spark even once, in ordinary waking life, has a reference point that the checkpoint cannot erase. The second prescribed practice is the rehearsal of the prayer itself. The Pistis Sophia preserves what appear to be actual liturgical texts used for this rehearsal, formulas that were spoken regularly, not just at the moment of dying. The logic is the same logic that underlies any rehearsal of a critical procedure. You do not learn the evacuation route when the building is on fire. You learn it in advance, repeatedly, until the route is automatic. The soul that has spoken the prayer of recognition hundreds of times in life will speak it at the checkpoint without effort, without having to remember it, because it has become structural. The third prescribed practice is the cultivation of what several Gnostic schools call detachment from material identification, and this is the practice that gets most consistently misread as world rejection or asceticism. Some Gnostic schools did take it in an ascetic direction. Others, particularly the Valentinians, understood it differently. Detachment from material identification does not mean rejecting pleasure or beauty or relationship. It means maintaining at all times, alongside whatever the material experience is, an awareness that the experience is occurring within a system that is not your ultimate home. The Valentinian teacher Heraclion, whose commentary on the Gospel of John survives in fragments quoted by Origen, describes this as living in the world the way a traveler lives in an inn, using what the inn provides, being grateful for its shelter, but never confusing the inn for home and never unpacking as if you intend to stay forever. A soul that has cultivated this orientation throughout a lifetime arrives at the moment of death in a fundamentally different state than a soul that identified completely with its material existence. It is not more enlightened in any mystical sense, It is simply less confused at the moment when confusion is most dangerous. The fourth prescribed practice, and this is the one that appears most explicitly in the Sethian texts, particularly the three steels of Seth and Allergenes, is the practice of ascending consciousness during life. These texts are not read as metaphor by the tradition that produced them. A soul that has made this ascent in practice, in life while still embodied, arrives at the post-mortem checkpoint with navigational experience rather than navigational theory. The checkpoint is not new territory. It has been traversed before. These four practices together constitute what the tradition understands as preparation. Not prayer in the sense of hoping something good will happen. Preparation in the sense of training for a specific encounter with a specific set of conditions. The encounter is certain. The conditions are known. The outcome depends entirely on whether the soul has done the work. So the work has been done. The practices are embedded. The soul carries navigational memory, not theory, but lived experience of the territories it is about to enter again, this time without a body to return to. Now the moment comes. The Gnostic texts are not vague about what happens at death. They are not poetic or impressionistic. They describe a sequence, a specific unfolding of events that the departing soul will encounter. And when you read these descriptions with fresh eyes, without the inherited framework of heavens and hells and judgment thrones, what they describe is something far stranger and far more structured than anything popular spirituality has prepared you for. The Pistis Sophia, a text composed in Greek and dated by scholars to somewhere between the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, contains what amounts to a detailed account of post-mortem navigation, not as allegory, as instruction. The text describes a soul leaving the body and immediately being approached, not by angels in the conventional sense, by what the text calls the collectors, receivers, beings assigned to meet the soul at the threshold and direct it toward its next destination. Read that again. Assigned to meet the soul, beings with a function, beings with a specific directive. This is not a welcome party. This is processing. The collectors in the Pistis Sophia are not described as evil in the pantomime sense. They are described as efficient. They have a system. The soul arrives, and the collectors assess it, not its sins in the moral ledger sense, but its luminosity, the amount of light it carries, the degree to which the divine spark has been remembered, activated, cultivated during the incarnation just completed. If the light is sufficient, the soul passes through. The collectors have no authority over a soul whose light exceeds the threshold of their jurisdiction. If the light is insufficient, the soul is redirected. And this is where the tunnel appears. The tunnel of light that so many near-death experiences describe. The warm, beckoning, luminous corridor that seems to promise arrival, reunion, completion, is not what it appears to be in the Gnostic framework. The texts do not use the word tunnel, obviously. They were written 2,000 years before near-death experience research became a field. But what they describe is functionally identical, a passage of light that draws the soul forward and deposits it in a realm of apparent peace and familiarity. The Nag Hammadi text, known as the Hypostasis of the Archons, scholars date it to the 3rd century CE, describes the Archons as beings who construct appearances, who build convincing simulations of divine reality, who are capable of fashioning something that looks like liberation and functions as recapture. This is the mechanism. The tunnel is not the destination. The tunnel is the intake corridor of a recycling system. Now, and this matters, the Gnostic position is not that near-death experiences are lying. It is not that the warmth they feel is fabricated or meaningless. The position is more precise and more troubling than that. The warmth is real. The sense of love and welcome is real. The presence of familiar figures, deceased relatives, beings of light, is real within the framework of its own level. But reality within the archonic levels is not the same as reality at the level of the pleroma. A convincing simulation of home is not home. Think about what that means practically. You die. You arrive at a threshold, and what you encounter there is designed, not randomly generated, designed to feel exactly like what you most need to feel in order to stop resisting, in order to move forward into the system without hesitation. in order to consent, whether consciously or not, to the next cycle. The deepest manipulation is not the one that feels like a trap. The deepest manipulation is the one that feels like rescue. Sophia, in the Gnostic cosmological account, fell not because she was forced. She fell because she acted from her own desire, without the consent of the full pleroma. The archons who manage the material realm are themselves the product of an act that felt, in the moment, like a move toward something rather than a fall away from it. This is the texture of the system. It does not announce itself as a prison. It announces itself as the only home you've ever known, and at the moment of death, when you are most vulnerable, most disoriented, most open to guidance. That announcement comes with everything it has. The question the Gnostic tradition asks at this point is simple and devastating. What does the soul do next? The soul does not simply float upward after death in some undifferentiated mystical ascent. The Gnostic cosmological texts describe what can only be called an architecture, a layered structure of domains, each governed by a specific archonic power, each presenting a specific test or challenge to the ascending soul. The Apocryphon of John, the text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, dated by scholars to approximately the 2nd century CE, describes 7 primary archons corresponding to the 7 classical planetary spheres: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon. These are not mere astronomical objects in the Gnostic framework. They are jurisdictional territories, administrative zones of the demiurgic system, each one a layer of the prison that must be traversed if the soul is to reach the 8th sphere, the Ogdoad, and beyond that, the true pleroma. Each archon, the Apocryphon of John specifies, has a name, has a face, has a specific quality of consciousness that it attempts to impose upon the soul passing through its domain. Yaldabaoth, the chief archon, rules the outermost layer and is described as the most dangerous, not because of raw power, but because of his claim. He claims to be God. He claims that his realm is the highest there is. He claims that arrival in his territory constitutes arrival at the ultimate destination. This is the theological core of the tunnel of light problem. The chief archon's realm is luminous. It is vast. It is described in terms that sound unmistakably like what Western religious traditions call heaven, and it may well be what Western religious traditions call heaven. The Gnostic critique of conventional religion is not that heaven doesn't exist. It is that what most traditions call heaven is a penultimate stopping point, administered by a being who does not want souls to leave. The text of Pistis Sophia elaborates this structure with specific detail about what happens at each checkpoint. The soul is challenged. It is asked, in effect, to identify itself, to demonstrate its origin and its nature. The archons of each sphere have what the text calls a mystery, a password, a seal, a mode of recognition, and a soul that cannot demonstrate its pneumatic nature is redirected downward, back into the recycling cycle. This is not metaphor. This is instruction. The text is telling the reader something completely specific. The archons will ask. You must be able to answer, and the answer is not a verbal recitation. The answer is a demonstrated state of being, a quality of luminosity, a degree of remembering, a specific orientation of consciousness that the archonic checkpoint cannot override or redirect. The first book of Jur, another Nag Hammadi era text, goes further. It provides what appear to be the actual seals, the actual responses, the actual modes of presentation that allow a soul to pass through each archonic layer without detention. These were not metaphors for the people who wrote them and the people who transmitted them at risk of death. These were practical navigational documents. Now consider the implication. If these checkpoints are real, in the sense the texts describe, if the post-mortem territory is structured, administered, and designed to redirect souls who do not demonstrate their true nature, then the entire framework of passive, faith-based approaches to death and afterlife is catastrophically inadequate. Not morally wrong, not theologically mistaken in some abstract sense. Inadequate the way a map of the wrong city is inadequate when you need to navigate a specific set of streets. You can believe sincerely, you can be good, you can live with integrity and kindness, and genuine devotion to whatever you understand as the divine. And if you arrive at the archonic checkpoint with sincerity, but without navigational competence, the texts suggest, sincerity does not save you. The checkpoint is not a moral evaluation. It is an identification procedure. This is why the Gnostic tradition placed such emphasis on gnosis rather than faith. Not because faith is valueless, but because at the specific moment of post-mortem challenge, what is required is not belief in something external. What is required is recognition of something internal. The pneumatic spark, the divine fragment that predates the archons, that was never subject to their jurisdiction, that carries within it an inherent claim to passage, that no archonic authority can legitimately deny. The archons can challenge. They can present appearances. They can manufacture environments of comfort and familiarity, designed to stop the soul's ascent before it reaches the layers they cannot reach. But they cannot manufacture the actual light of the pleroma. They cannot counterfeit the genuine recognition that occurs when a soul knows, not believes, knows what it is. This is the distinction the entire tradition is organized around, and it is the distinction that the tunnel of light, at the moment of death, is specifically designed to prevent you from making. There is a specific prayer preserved in the Gnostic tradition that addresses this exact situation. Not a prayer in the conventional sense, not petition, not gratitude, not an address to an external deity asking for something. A prayer in the older, more precise sense, a formal declaration of identity and origin, addressed to a specific power, in a specific context, for a specific purpose. The context is the post-mortem checkpoint. The purpose is passage. The text that contains this prayer in its most complete form is the Pistis Sophia, which translates roughly as faith wisdom, Sophia being the Greek word for wisdom that appears throughout the Gnostic corpus as the name of the divine feminine power whose descent initiated the material creation. The Pistis Sophia is long, complex, and was considered so dangerous by the early Orthodox Church that copies were systematically destroyed. The versions that survived did so in Coptic translation, preserved in manuscripts that were hidden, buried, or carried to the margins of the known world by Gnostic communities fleeing persecution. The prayer the text contains is addressed not to the God above all things, not to the monad, not to the invisible spirit of the pleroma. It is addressed downward, to the archons, to the powers of the checkpoint, and it begins with a declaration that functions as a seal. The soul declares its origin, not its earthly origin, not its name, its family, its nation, its deeds, its cosmic origin, where it came from before the material world, what it is, underneath the layers of matter and conditioning and incarnational forgetting. The declaration establishes, in the hearing of the archonic powers, that this soul does not belong to their jurisdiction, that it passed through their realms on the way down, on the way into incarnation, and that passage through their realms on the way in did not constitute ownership. The archons received the soul in trust. The soul is now reclaiming itself. This is the legal logic of the prayer, and the Gnostic tradition treated it as precisely that, a legal matter, a matter of jurisdiction and claim. The archons are not omnipotent. They are administrators. They operate within a system that has rules, and the rules, according to the texts, include one that they cannot override. A soul that correctly identifies itself as pneumatic, as carrying the genuine spark of pleroma consciousness, cannot be held. The second book of Jeux, preserved in the same manuscript tradition as the first, contains what scholars have described as a series of apotropaic prayers, prayers designed to ward off, to repel, to prevent detention. Each prayer corresponds to a specific archonic sphere. Each contains what the text calls the name of the archon, the seal of the soul, and the declaration of passage. The practitioner who memorized these, and the Gnostic communities did memorize them, this was part of what initiation transmitted, arrived at the checkpoint not as a supplicant, but as someone exercising a prior rite. Now let's be specific about the structure, because structure matters here. This is not poetry. This is a navigational instrument. The prayer has three components. First, the identification of origin, the declaration that the soul comes from the light above all lights, from the realm before the demiurge constructed his prison, from the fullness that the archons can diminish but cannot destroy. Second, the declaration of non-belonging, the explicit statement that the material realm and its administrative powers received this soul as a guest in transit, not as a permanent resident, and that the period of transit is now concluded. Third, the invocation of the higher authority, the naming of the power above the archons, the light that the archonic system was built in the shadow of, as the witness and guarantor of the soul's right to passage. Three components: origin, non-belonging, higher authority. Think about what this prayer is doing mechanically. It is refusing the framing. At the moment of death, the archonic system presents a frame. You are a soul that belongs here. This is your realm. Proceed through the familiar corridor toward the warm light and the waiting figures. The prayer refuses that frame. It substitutes a different frame, not politely, not tentatively, but with the formal authority of someone who knows their own legal standing. The soul does not argue, it does not plead, it declares. This is why the Gnostic teachers insisted that the prayer could not be learned at the moment of death. It had to be so deeply embedded that it arose automatically, not as a remembered thing but as a known thing. The difference between remembering a password and recognizing your own face. One requires retrieval, one simply is. The tradition understood that at the moment of post-mortem disorientation, the capacity for retrieval is exactly what the archonic environment is designed to impair. The warmth, the familiarity, the sense of arrival. These are not random. They are precisely calibrated to produce a state in which critical consciousness is suspended and the soul flows forward without examination, without declaration, without claim. The prayer breaks that flow. It reorients. It reasserts the soul's own navigational axis in the moment when the archonic system is working hardest to dissolve it. Here is something the tradition makes very clear, and that is almost universally misunderstood in modern spiritual circles. You cannot save the prayer for the moment you need it. This is not a practical inconvenience. It is a structural feature of the challenge itself. The post-mortem checkpoint, as the Gnostic texts describe it, is not a neutral environment in which the soul retains all of its capacities and simply chooses what to do. It is an active environment, one that the hypostasis of the archons describes, with remarkable specificity, as designed to confuse the soul about its own nature. The archons are not passive gatekeepers who step aside when shown the correct credentials. They are active agents whose function is to prevent the soul from producing those credentials by undermining the soul's confidence that it has any credentials to produce. The confusion does not begin at death. The texts are explicit about this. The confusion begins at birth. The passage into incarnation involves what the Apocryphon of John calls a counterfeit spirit, a kind of archonic overlay that sits alongside the genuine pneumatic spark and whispers a competing account of what the soul is. The counterfeit spirit says, "You are a body, you are a personality, you are the product of your history and your relationships and your accumulated experiences. When the body dies, you die, or if something persists, it is small, contingent, and dependent on external mercy for its fate." The pneumatic spark says something entirely different. You are prior to all of this. You existed before this world was constructed. You will persist after it dissolves. The archons have no legitimate claim on you. You are, in the deepest sense, not from here. Both of these voices are present throughout a human life. The work of gnosis, the entire point of the practices described earlier in this material, is not to acquire something new, but to progressively amplify the pneumatic voice until it becomes not louder than the counterfeit spirit, but more fundamentally real, more recognized, more the baseline from which everything else is interpreted. When that process has been carried far enough, not completed, not perfected, but carried far enough, the post-mortem environment encounters a soul that is not starting from scratch. The archonic confusion finds a consciousness that has already navigated this territory, at least partially, through contemplative practice. The warmth of the tunnel finds a soul that has already, in meditative states, encountered warmth that was not the pleroma and learned to distinguish it from warmth that was. This is why the embodied life matters so much in the Gnostic framework, not because the material world is ultimately real or ultimately important, but because it is the training ground, the place where the soul can practice recognition in conditions that are demanding enough to constitute real practice, but forgiving enough, most of the time, that a mistake does not end the opportunity to try again. The prayer, then, is not a text to memorize, or rather, memorization is the beginning, not the end. The prayer is a state of being to inhabit. Every time the practitioner speaks the prayer during an embodied life, they are not rehearsing a performance. They are reinforcing a recognition. They are saying to themselves, again, what they are, where they are from, what jurisdiction applies to them, and what jurisdiction does not. And every time the external world, through loss, through suffering, through the grinding archonic pressure of material existence, tries to overwrite that recognition with the counterfeit account, the prayer is the mechanism of return. Not return to a comfortable feeling, return to a known orientation, return to the navigational axis that the post-mortem checkpoint will attempt to dissolve. The Valentinian teacher Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, described the gnosis as something that had to become what he called second nature, meaning not a learned overlay on top of the ordinary personality, but a new baseline from which the ordinary personality was understood and operated. Second nature, the metaphor is precise. First nature, in the Gnostic account, is what the archons have constructed, the personality, the body identification, the sense of being a separate self in a world of other separate selves. Second nature is the pneumatic recognition that all of that is real, at its level, but not primary, not what the soul actually is in the deepest sense. Living the prayer means spending a human life incrementally shifting from first nature to second nature, not escaping the world. The texts never advocate for that in any simple sense, but refusing to grant the world the final word about what you are, refusing the archonic account of your own identity, even while functioning within the archonic realm. By the time death comes for a soul that has lived this way, the prayer is not something the soul reaches for. It is something the soul is, and a soul that has become its own navigational declaration cannot be redirected by an environment designed for souls that have forgotten theirs. This is the teaching, not a technique among techniques, not a practice to add to a spiritual routine. The orientation of an entire life, structured deliberately around the single most important encounter that life is a preparation for. The Valentinian communities that survived into the 3rd and 4th centuries were not mystery schools in the theatrical sense. They were not initiatory lodges with secret handshakes and ritual chambers. They were, by most accounts, ordinary assemblies of people who had organized their entire daily existence around a single problem. How does a fragment of divine light, temporarily sealed inside a body, inside a world built by an inferior administrator, stay oriented toward its actual origin point, while everything in that world is designed to make it forget? This is a practical problem, not a philosophical one, not an abstract theological debate about the nature of the cosmos. A practical, daily, lived problem, the kind that requires not just correct belief, but structured habit, because belief alone does not survive the archonic environment. The Gnostic teachers understood this with unusual clarity. The archons do not need to argue you out of your convictions. They simply need to exhaust you, distract you, fill your sensory field with noise, demand your attention for survival, and wait. Most souls who enter with some residual memory of the pleroma lose it, not through philosophical defeat, but through attrition. The world grinds the memory down gradually, the way water shapes stone, not through force, but through relentless, daily, cumulative pressure. This is why the Gnostic approach was never just about holding correct information. It was about building a life architecture that defended the inner orientation against that attrition. Prayer, community, regular reading and contemplation of pneumatic texts, rituals of anamnesis, unforgetting, designed to interrupt the archonic trance at regular intervals. These were not ornamental, they were structural countermeasures. The Apocryphon of John, which scholars date to the late 2nd century, and which the Nag Hammadi discovery preserved in its most complete form, describes a repeated divine intervention on behalf of trapped souls. The text calls it the sending of a helper, a messenger who enters the material realm not to destroy it, but to wake something inside the people who have forgotten what they are. That pattern of sending and waking runs through Gnostic literature like a spine. The point is never the messenger, the point is always the waking. And what the Gnostic teachers noticed, what they built their communities around, is that the waking is not a single event, it is a process. You do not wake once and remain awake. You wake, and then the archonic environment immediately begins working to put you back under, and so you wake again, and again. Every practice, every prayer, every act of deliberate anamnesis is another waking. The life of a pneumatic soul in the material world is not a life of sustained illumination. It is a life of repeated return to what has been temporarily obscured. This reframe matters because it changes the entire emotional texture of the spiritual path. The Gnostic does not measure themselves against a standard of unbroken clarity. They measure themselves against a practice of consistent return. Have I returned again today? Have I interrupted the archonic trance again this morning? Have I remembered, even briefly, what I actually am beneath the conditioning the material world has layered over me? That is the metric, not altitude, frequency. The prayer we have been examining throughout this script functions within that framework. It is not a one-time incantation. It is one of the primary instruments of repeated return, a tool for the daily waking. The soul that prays it in life is not performing a magical operation. It is rehearsing, again and again, the navigational act that death will require of it, so that when the tunnel appears, when the light pulses with that warm magnetic pull, when the voice says come home, when every archonic mechanism activates simultaneously to redirect the soul back into the recycling structure, the soul already knows the correct response from 10,000 repetitions. This is why the Gnostic teachers said, preparation for death begins the day you wake to what you are, not the day you feel yourself dying, the day you first understand the nature of the realm you are living in and the nature of the soul you are carrying through it. From that day forward, every morning is a rehearsal. Every act of prayer is a navigation drill. Every moment of deliberate remembering is a deposit into the account that the soul will draw on at the moment of its most consequential test. The architecture of a Gnostic life is not built for comfort inside the archonic realm. It is built for performance at the threshold of it. Let's be precise about what the Gnostic sources actually say the tunnel of light is, because this is the point where the teaching becomes either the most disturbing thing you have encountered in spiritual literature or the most liberating, depending entirely on whether you have already sensed it without having language for it. The Pistis Sophia, a Gnostic text preserved in Coptic and dating to approximately the 3rd century, contains an extended cosmological account of what happens to souls after death. The text is detailed in a way that most people find either overwhelming or remarkable. It does not speak in vague metaphor about the afterlife. It describes mechanisms. It describes what the archons do, how they do it, and why. According to the Pistis Sophia, the material world is enclosed within a series of archonic boundaries. The text calls them the fate sphere, a layered structure through which all souls must pass both at birth and at death. At death, the soul rises through these layers, and the archons at each layer have a function: to assess whether the soul is still bound to the material realm by unresolved attachments, by unprocessed experience, by the residue of a life lived in identification with the body and its appetites. If the archons find that residue, and in most souls they do, the soul is held, processed, and eventually redirected back into incarnation. The light at the end of the tunnel, in the Gnostic framework, is not the light of the true God. It is not a signal from the pleroma. It is the light of the fate sphere itself, the outermost boundary of the archonic domain, designed to appear as a terminus, as an arrival point, as home. And for souls that have not developed the gnosis, to distinguish between the counterfeit and the genuine, it functions exactly as designed. They move toward it. They are received by it. And the cycle continues. The book of the Pistis Sophia describes Sophia herself, the divine aeon whose fall initiated the material creation, as repeatedly calling out from within the archonic trap, trying to signal the true light of the pleroma to come below the boundary and rescue her. The text records her 13 penitential prayers, each one a navigational cry across the distance between the counterfeit realm and the genuine source. What is significant for our purposes is the direction of her prayer. She does not call to the light she can see. She calls past it. She calls beyond the visible boundary, to what lies outside the entire structure. This distinction, calling past the visible light to the invisible source, is the exact movement that the prayer of navigation enacts at death. The soul that has learned to call past what is visible, past what is warm and welcoming and looks exactly like a rival, to the true pleroma beyond the archonic architecture, that soul is doing precisely what Sophia does in the Pistis Sophia, enacting the original divine gesture of recognition across a field designed to obscure the original. Now here is where the teaching lands with particular force. The reason the counterfeit light is so effective, the reason it has redirected souls reliably for the entire duration of human history, according to the Gnostic account, is not because it is subtle. It is because it feels like what you have always wanted. It feels like rest. It feels like recognition. It feels like someone who knows you completely, has opened a door, and is waiting on the other side. This is not an accident. This is the mechanism at its most sophisticated. The archons, in the Gnostic cosmology, have access to the deepest longing of every soul they manage, the longing for the pleroma, for the fullness, for the home the soul half remembers and cannot name. And they have constructed a simulacrum of that homecoming at the boundary of their domain. Not enough to actually satisfy the longing, enough to temporarily override the navigational instinct of a soul that has not developed the discernment to notice the difference. The discernment that notices the difference is gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of one's own divine nature, not inherited from a text or a teacher, but activated by the contact of authentic teaching with the pneumatic element already present in the soul. A soul with that discernment does not stop at the counterfeit light, not because it is cold or dismissive of beauty, but because it has already felt, in life, through the practice of prayer and anamnesis, what the genuine pleroma light actually is, and the comparison is not subtle. A candle and the sun are both light. A soul that has stood in sunlight will not mistake a candle for it, however warmly it burns. There is a passage in the Gospel of Philip, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, a Valentinian composition dated by scholars to approximately the 3rd century, that stops most readers cold the first time they encounter it. The passage says, in effect, that those who have not yet awakened to their own nature are already dead while they walk the earth, and those who have gnosis are already alive even before they leave the body. This is not rhetorical hyperbole. The Gnostic teachers meant it as a precise cosmological description. Here is what they meant. The body is an archonic construction. The personality assembled around that body, the preferences, the fears, the social identity, the narrative of self that the person presents to the world and to themselves, is also an archonic construction, built from material the archons provided and maintained by the archonic environment. A soul that is fully identified with that construction is, from the Gnostic perspective, experiencing a kind of death in life. Not metaphorically, literally. The pneumatic element, the divine spark at the center, is real and present, but it is surrounded by so many layers of archonic material that it cannot express itself, cannot orient toward the pleroma, cannot function as anything other than a power source for a structure that belongs to the demiurge. This is not a judgment against such souls. The Gnostic texts are not contemptuous of the unawakened. The Apocryphon of John describes the divine repeatedly sending helpers precisely because the situation of the unawakened soul is understood as a genuine tragedy, a real light, genuinely imprisoned, genuinely unable to find its way home without intervention. The compassion in the Gnostic system, when you read it carefully, is not for an abstract category. It is for this, for the specific suffering of a divine being who cannot remember what it is. But the teaching is clear about something that modern spiritual frameworks often soften. Not every soul navigates the post-death threshold the same way. And the difference is not arbitrary. The Gospel of Philip distinguishes between 3 categories: hilics, psychics, and pneumatics. I have addressed these categories in earlier sections of this script, but at this stage in the discussion, it is worth returning to them in the specific context of the post-death encounter with the tunnel and the light. The Hylic soul, the soul most fully identified with the material layer, does not encounter the threshold as a crisis of navigation. It encounters it as a completion of what it always was. The material layer was its home. The archonic realm receives it back without resistance, because there was never any resistance to overcome. The soul returns to the fate sphere, is processed, and is reincarnated into the conditions the archons determine appropriate. This is not punishment. In the Gnostic framework, it is simply the natural consequence of a life in which the pneumatic element was never activated. The psychic soul, the soul that has some spiritual orientation, that has pursued goodness and meaning, and perhaps even prayer and practice within an orthodox framework, but has done so within the archonic structure, rather than in recognition of what lies beyond it. This soul has a more complex experience. It has real spiritual development. It has accumulated genuine light, but the light it has accumulated is oriented toward the demiurge, toward the God of this world, not toward the true pleroma beyond. And so at the threshold, it moves toward the light it has been trained to seek, which is, in the Gnostic account, exactly the archonic boundary. It arrives where it was pointed. The recycling continues. The pneumatic soul, the soul that has activated genuine gnosis, that has developed the discernment to distinguish between the demiurge and the true God, between the counterfeit light and the genuine pleroma, between the archonic account of its identity and its actual nature. This soul is the one for whom the prayer is a survival instrument. It is the one that arrives at the threshold with both the recognition of the counterfeit and the navigational capacity to call past it. This is who this teaching is actually for. Not everyone in a general sense, not every soul equally. The soul that has already sensed that the God of this world is not the final word. The soul that has already felt, underneath all the conditioning, underneath all the archonic noise, some residual memory of a fullness that nothing in this world has ever successfully replicated. The soul that watches the world and feels, not cynicism, not despair, but a precise, specific, almost diagnostic sense that this is not where it comes from. If you are watching this and feeling that recognition, you are not choosing a belief system. You are remembering a fact about your own nature. The Gnostic teachers would say, you already know this. The prayer does not create the knowing. It activates what was always present and gives it the navigational structure it needs to function at the moment that matters most. We began this script with a claim that the tunnel of light is not what mainstream near-death research describes it as, not what popular spiritual culture presents it as, and not what the traditions that benefit from your continued participation in the recycling structure would like you to believe it is. We said the Gnostics had a different account. We said that account was older, more precise, and more dangerous to the dominant cosmological order than anything the institutional church wanted preserved. We have now covered that account in full. The pleroma, the true divine fullness, the realm of genuine light that has nothing to do with the archonic boundary, is your actual point of origin. Not a destination you earn, not a reward granted by a creator who tests you. Your origin, the place from which the divine spark in you was emitted, before the fall of Sophia, before the construction of the material world, before the demiurge declared himself the only God and sealed the exits. The material world, this world, the one you were born into, the one that has shaped your personality and organized your desires, and told you a story about who you are and what matters, is an archonic construction, real in its effects, real in the suffering it generates, but not real in the sense that matters. It is not the final layer of reality. It is not the frame within which your nature is ultimately defined. The tunnel of light at death is the most sophisticated mechanism the archonic structure deploys against the soul, not because it is violent or coercive, because it is beautiful, warm, and feels exactly like coming home. This is the genius of the counterfeit. It does not trap you by force. It traps you by offering the closest approximation of what you actually want, the pleroma, at a level that is just real enough to redirect you before you get there. The Gnostic prayer of navigation is the response the soul has available to that mechanism. It is not a magic formula. It is a declaration of orientation, rehearsed through a lifetime of practice, that tells the archonic boundary what the soul is not a product of this realm, not bound by the fate sphere, not subject to the recycling structure, and simultaneously calls past the counterfeit to the genuine source. I want to be honest with you about something, and I say this not as a theological disclaimer, but because the teaching demands honesty at every level. The prayer is not a guarantee. The Gnostic sources do not promise that any soul that learns the correct words will automatically breach the archonic boundary. The texts are consistent about this. The words without the gnosis behind them are empty. The prayer is not a formula. It is the articulation of a lived orientation. And a lived orientation is exactly that. It must be lived, over time, with consistency, with real practice, with the kind of daily commitment to anamnesis that the Valentinian communities built their entire community life around. What you carry out of this script is not a tool, it is a framework, a cosmological map of the territory your soul will cross, an understanding of what the light is, what it is not, what lies beyond it, and what the soul that knows these things needs to do at the moment of crossing. The Apocryphon of John closes with a passage that has stayed with me in a way that very few lines of ancient literature do. In it, the divine figure who has been delivering the revelation to John says, in effect, "I will come again whenever a soul calls from within the prison of the world, and I will answer, not once, every time." The door, in the Gnostic account, does not close. The pleroma does not stop calling. The counterfeit is powerful, but the genuine is inexhaustible. You were born into a realm designed to make you forget what you are. Every system in that realm, biological, social, cultural, religious, psychological, runs on your forgetting. The moment you remember, even partially, even imperfectly, even in the fragmented, flickering way that most people experience gnosis in this life, you become something the archonic structure cannot fully account for. Not a rebel, not a threat in any dramatic sense. Simply a soul that knows where it comes from and has started, through practice and daily return, to orient consistently toward that origin. That orientation, sustained across a lifetime, becomes the navigational capacity the soul carries to the threshold. The prayer names it. The practice builds it. The life lived in deliberate remembering of your actual nature is the preparation for the only journey that ultimately matters. The tunnel will appear. The light will pulse. Every archonic mechanism will activate. And the soul that has spent its time here, learning to call past the visible to the invisible, that soul will already know what to do. This is the teaching the Gnostics preserved. This is what the church burned. This is what the Nag Hammadi library, buried in the Egyptian desert for 16 centuries, waited to return to the world. It has been returned. You have heard it. What you do with it is the only question that remains.